At my sister's $1 million wedding. She pointed the microphone at my table and laughed. She told a room of 300 elite guests that I was just a gate guard. She mocked my uniform and said no man would ever marry me. My mother eagerly chimed in to call me the biggest disappointment of her life. The entire ballroom erupted in cruel laughter. But the joke ended when the groom's billionaire father suddenly stood up trembling and revealed exactly who I really was. My mother froze in horror, and my sister literally fainted on the marble floor. Let me tell you how a supposed gate guard brought a dynasty to its knees. My name is Beatrice. I am 33 years old, and I have spent the last 14 years building an empire out of pure spite. I was sitting at table 42, which was strategically placed right next to the swinging kitchen doors. Every time a waiter rushed out with a tray of champagne, the heavy wooden door bumped against the back of my chair. It was a very clear message from my family about exactly where I stood in their hierarchy. Up on the grand stage, my 29-year-old sister Madison was tapping her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The spectacular crystal chandeliers of the five-star luxury hotel illuminated her custom designer gown. Beside her stood her new husband, Donovan. Donovan was a wealthy African-American man whose family owned a massive commercial real estate empire in the city. He wore a smug smile, wrapping an arm around Madison as she took the microphone. She flashed her perfect pageant smile and looked directly at my dark corner of the room. I want to give a very special shout-out to my older sister Beatrice, Madison announced. Her voice echoed through the massive speakers, cutting through the soft instrumental music. She actually had to beg her manager for a shift off just to be here tonight. You see, Beatrice is a gate guard. Just a few days ago, I was driving through a very exclusive neighborhood, and I saw her standing at a driveway in a heavy tactical vest and combat boots. It is such a tragedy that she works so hard for minimum wage. I used to think no man would ever marry a woman who looks like a night watchman. But thank you for coming anyway, Beatrice. I wanted you to see what a real successful life looks like. The ballroom erupted into laughter. 300 guests, mostly wealthy socialites, real estate moguls, and Wall Street investors, turned in their plush seats to stare at me. I could see the pity and the amusement in their eyes. Donovan chuckled, whispering something into Madison's ear that made her giggle maliciously. I did not cry. I did not even flinch. I simply picked up my steak knife and calmly sawed into the overcooked, rubbery piece of meat they had served me. While every other guest in the room enjoyed premium filet mignon and lobster tail, my plate held a dry, tasteless cut of beef. From the VIP table at the very front of the room, my mother Catherine spoke up. She did not bother to lower her voice. She wanted Donovan's elite family to know she had no part in my supposed failure. She has always been the biggest disappointment of this family, my mother declared to the wealthy women sitting next to her. We tried to raise her right, but you cannot fix stubbornness. Blood is blood, I suppose, so we had to invite her to fill a seat. My father William marched over to my table, his face red with irritation. He slammed his hand down on the white tablecloth next to my plate, knocking over my water glass. Eat fast and leave through the service exit, he hissed at me, his voice dripping with venom. Your cheap clothes are ruining the aesthetic of this room. When you were 19, I told you to pack your bags and get out of my house if you refused to go to medical school. I told you that computers and security systems were absolute garbage. Look at Madison now. She just married the heir to a commercial real estate dynasty, and you are out there guarding driveways. You had to pay for your own community college by flipping burgers, while we gave Madison everything she ever wanted. Clearly, we made the right investment. I looked up at my father's angry face, keeping my expression entirely neutral. What Madison did not know, and what my parents refused to see, was that I was not a gate guard. I had not been standing at that Beverly Hills mansion working for minimum wage. I was there because it was my own $50 million estate. I was personally inspecting the advanced security grid I had just designed and installed for my own home. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Sentinel, the leading cybersecurity and private asset protection firm in the country. I protect the assets of billionaires, politicians, and massive global corporations. My net worth dwarfed the combined wealth of everyone sitting in that ballroom. For 14 years, I had poured every ounce of my rejection into building my company. While Madison was handed luxury cars and fully funded vacations, I was sleeping on the floor of my cramped office, writing security algorithms that would eventually revolutionize the tech industry. My parents had spent their entire lives worshiping money and status, stepping on anyone who did not fit their perfect mold. They viewed me as a humiliating secret and treated me like a burden. I chewed my terrible steak, swallowed it, and wiped my mouth with a cheap paper napkin. I reached into my small clutch and pulled out my phone. I opened a highly encrypted messaging app and typed a quick, precise message to my chief operating officer. Freeze all Apex Sentinel security protocols on the Groom's family accounts immediately. Lock down their entire digital infrastructure. Let us see how long they last without me. I hit send, placed the phone face down on the table, and took a slow sip of my tap water. The trap was set, and I was more than ready to watch their perfect illusion crumble to pieces. The cool glass of tap water barely touched my lips before I set it back down on the cheap linen of table 42. I did not look at my mother or my father. Instead, I raised my right hand just a fraction of an inch. That was all it took. The head sommelier of the hotel, a distinguished man named Francois, had been hovering nervously by the kitchen doors ever since I sat down. He knew exactly who I was. The hotel manager had undoubtedly circulated my photo to the senior staff the moment the acquisition paperwork cleared last week. Francois practically sprinted to my table, his face pale and glistening with sweat. He bypassed the wealthy socialites waving their empty champagne flutes and stopped squarely in front of my chair. He bowed his head so low, I thought his nose might touch the tablecloth. "How may I serve you tonight, madam?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. I ignored the cheap steak sitting in front of me. "Francois, please bring me a bottle of the 1990 Chateau Margaux from the private reserve vault. The one we discussed during the acquisition audit last Tuesday." "Right away, madam. An excellent choice." He bowed again and rushed off toward the VIP wine cellar, leaving the other guests at the nearby tables staring in utter confusion. A gate guard ordering wine that cost more than a compact car was not something they expected to see. Within 3 minutes, Francois returned, flanked by 2 assistant servers. He presented the dust-covered bottle with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic. At $20,000 a bottle, it was not meant for the reject table by the kitchen. Francois uncorked it with practiced precision and poured a generous amount into a fresh crystal glass, replacing my water goblet. The rich aroma of dark berries and aged oak drifted through the air, instantly catching the attention of the head table. My sister Paige stopped smiling. Her new husband Kendrick narrowed his eyes and stood up from his velvet chair. He whispered something to Paige before marching straight across the ballroom toward my table. Kendrick carried himself with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed the world owed him everything. As the heir to a prominent commercial real estate empire, he was used to getting his way. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo and a scowl that deepened with every step he took. He stopped right behind Francois and glared down at me. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Blair?" he demanded. His voice was low but thick with hostility. "Do you honestly think I'm going to let you stick me with a $20,000 bar tab? This is my wedding. I am paying for this venue, and I will not let a pathetic gate guard bleed my accounts dry just because you are bitter about your own miserable life." I picked up the crystal glass and admired the deep red color of the wine. "I am not sticking you with anything, Kendrick. I am simply enjoying a decent drink." He let out a harsh, mocking laugh that drew the attention of several Wall Street investors sitting at the adjacent tables. "You think you can afford this? You check IDs for a living. Let me make this very clear for you, Blair. I have friends in high places. Half the men in this room manage hedge funds on Wall Street, and the other half own half of this city. My family controls billions in commercial real estate. You are nothing but a stain on my perfect wedding day. If you do not put that glass down and walk out that service door right now, I will have my security physically drag you out to the curb." Before I could even respond to his ridiculous threat, my mother Catherine materialized beside him. She had rushed over from the VIP table, her face flushed with absolute fury. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor. "Blair, stop this instant," my mother hissed, leaning down so her face was inches from mine. "Why do you always have to ruin everything for your sister? Paige is marrying into true wealth tonight, and you are sitting here playing pretend with expensive wine you cannot possibly pay for. Have you no shame?" I looked at my mother, seeing the same bitter woman who had thrown my belongings into the freezing rain 14 years ago. I earned my success, mother, I replied evenly. You just never bothered to look past your own vanity to see it. My calm demeanor only infuriated her more. She lunged forward and aggressively snatched the crystal glass right out of my hand. The sudden violent movement sent a wave of the $20,000 vintage wine splashing directly onto the bodice of my custom-tailored silk dress. The dark red liquid soaked into the light fabric, spreading like a fresh wound across my chest. Several guests gasped. Francois the sommelier let out a horrified sound and took a step forward, but I raised a single finger to stop him. He froze instantly, stepping back into the shadows. My mother stood there, breathing heavily, holding the half-empty glass. "Look at what you made me do," she snapped, trying to shift the blame immediately. "You are making a fool of yourself and embarrassing our entire family. Look at you. You are a mess. Now get up and get out of here before you humiliate Paige any further." Kendrick crossed his arms over his chest and sneered at my ruined dress. "You heard your mother, Blair. The garbage goes out the back door. Do not make me call the hotel manager to have you forcefully removed." I did not panic. I did not cry over the ruined silk or the public humiliation. Instead, I reached for the stack of crisp white napkins on the table. I took one and calmly dabbed at the spilled wine on my dress. Then I picked up a clean, dry napkin and extended my hand, offering it directly to my mother. "You might want to wipe your hands, mother," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, icy tone that carried zero emotion. "You are gripping that glass so hard you are going to cut yourself." My mother stared at the napkin in my hand, as if it were a venomous snake refusing to take it. I let the napkin fall onto the table and turned my attention back to the arrogant groom standing above me. "Kendrick," I said, leaning back in my chair and looking him dead in the eye. "You talk a lot about your wealth and your powerful Wall Street friends. But you might want to check your phone right now." He scoffed, shaking his head. "What are you talking about?" I smiled a sharp, ruthless smile. "I am talking about your money, Kendrick. Wall Street friends will not help you when your black card starts bouncing at the catering desk. Check your phone. Let us see exactly how much of a billionaire you really are." Kendrick scoffed loudly, brushing off my warning like it was a minor annoyance. He adjusted the expensive silk lapels of his custom tuxedo and opened his mouth to deliver another arrogant insult. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the imported orchids lining the tables, highlighting a $1 million wedding that was entirely built on lies and stolen funds. Before a single word could escape his lips, a frantic woman in a sharp black suit practically sprinted across the marble floor. It was the lead wedding planner. She was clutching a glowing digital tablet against her chest, and her face had completely drained of color. She looked absolutely terrified. She grabbed Kendrick by the arm and pulled him aside, whispering frantically into his ear. "Sir, the catering director is refusing to serve the main course," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "The payment terminal rejected your card. He tried it 3 times. The bank says the account is completely frozen, and they are threatening to pack up the food right now." I sat perfectly still and watched his confident smirk evaporate into pure panic. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the bright lights. He yanked his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen. His thumb swiped aggressively, pulling up banking apps and urgent email alerts. I knew exactly what he was seeing on that glowing screen. 0 balances, declined transaction notifications, fraud warnings locking down every single account tied to his name and his family's vast real estate empire. The premium black card he had just tried to use to pay the final $75,000 catering invoice had bounced hard. Kendrick's head snapped up and he glared at me with pure unhinged rage. He marched back to the table, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "You did this," he shouted. His voice echoed across the quiet ballroom, slicing through the soft, classical music playing in the background. "You hacked my accounts. You hacked the hotel payment gateway." My mother gasped and stepped back, clutching her ruined wine-stained dress. My father stormed over, his face red with indignation. He demanded to know what I had done to sabotage his precious golden child's perfect wedding. He looked ready to physically strike me, but I did not blink. Kendrick was practically foaming at the mouth now. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are a cybercriminal, Blair. You are going to federal prison for this. Security. I want security in here right now. Throw this trash out and call the police. The sudden shouting drew the attention of everyone in the room. 300 elite guests, including hedge fund managers and socialites, stopped their conversations and turned to stare. The Wall Street executives Kendrick had been bragging about just minutes ago were now watching him with sharp, calculating eyes. In their world, money was the only language that mattered, and Kendrick had just been outed as a man who could not even pay his own catering bill. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a profound sense of peace. For 14 years, I had been the scapegoat, the outcast, the daughter who was never good enough. Now I held their entire world in the palm of my hand. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly swung open. 3 heavily armed hotel security guards stepped inside. They wore sharp tactical suits, earpieces, and expressions of absolute authority. The crowd parted for them, instantly sensing the intense shift in the atmosphere. Kendrick spotted the guards and waved them over frantically. "Right here," he barked, pointing at me again. "This woman is a trespasser and a cyber terrorist. She just breached my financial accounts and tried to ruin my wedding. Grab her and drag her out to the curb immediately. I want her arrested." The guards marched directly toward table 42. Their heavy boots echoed against the polished floor. My parents stepped back, expecting me to be hauled away in handcuffs. My mother wore a look of vindicated satisfaction, eager to see the family disappointment finally face severe consequences. Paige stood a few feet away, crossing her arms and smiling triumphantly. She was ready to watch me be humiliated and thrown into the cold street. But the guards did not grab me. They did not even look at Kendrick or my parents. The head of security, a tall, imposing man with a graying beard and a stern face, stopped perfectly in front of my chair. He ignored the screaming groom entirely. He clicked his heels together and bowed deeply, bending at a perfect 90-degree angle right in front of my table. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The only sound was the soft clinking of ice melting in the guests' water glasses. The wealthy investors and socialites stared in absolute shock. The head of security straightened up and looked at me with absolute respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice booming clearly across the quiet room. "Do you want us to escort them off your property?" Kendrick's jaw dropped. The color drained from his face as he stared at the security chief as if the man had just grown a second head. My father looked completely bewildered, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. My mother clutched her chest, taking a shaky step backward. Paige let out a loud, obnoxious scoff, breaking the heavy silence. She marched forward, her heavy silk wedding gown rustling aggressively against the marble floor. "This is pathetic," Blair Paige sneered. "Did you honestly pay these hotel guards to stage this little prank? You are so desperate for attention that you would bribe the staff to pretend you are important. Tell them to back off right now, or I will have you all fired and arrested." I remained seated, my posture completely relaxed. I looked up at my sister and her furious, fraudulent groom. I let the silence stretch for just a moment longer, ensuring that every single guest in the room was listening closely. "I did not hack the hotel system, Kendrick," I said, my voice ringing with crystal clear authority. "I bought the hotel last week. This entire venue is my property." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. My words hung in the air, wrapping around my family like a tight chain. I just told them I owned the very ground they were standing on. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. Then my father William let out a loud, forced laugh. It sounded harsh and desperate, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He clapped his hands together and looked around at the wealthy guests trying to do damage control. "Please excuse my eldest daughter," my father announced to the room with a wide, fake smile. "She has always had a very vivid imagination. She is clearly having some sort of mental breakdown. She works long hours at minimum wage jobs, so you must forgive her delusions." My mother Catherine immediately chimed in, nodding enthusiastically. "Yes, she is completely delusional. Do not listen to a word she says. She is just a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin her sister's perfect day because she has nothing of her own. She could not even afford a proper dress for this evening." Paige crossed her arms and glared at me. "You really need psychiatric help," Blair Paige said, dripping with condescension. "Buying this hotel. That is the most pathetic lie you have ever told. Now tell these rented security guards to leave before Kendrick has them all arrested for harassing us." But the three heavily armed hotel security guards did not move an inch. They remained standing at attention facing me, waiting for my command. They did not even acknowledge my parents or my sister. Before anyone could say another word, Kendrick's phone began to vibrate violently in his hand. The screen lit up with a barrage of urgent notifications. It was not just one message. It was dozens of them arriving back to back in rapid succession. The loud, persistent buzzing cut through the tension in the room. Kendrick looked down at his screen, annoyance flashing across his face. But as his eyes scanned the incoming messages, his expression morphed into pure, unadulterated terror. It was a frantic message from his chief financial officer. I knew exactly what it said because my team at Aegis Vanguard had been monitoring their systems for weeks. The commercial real estate empire owned by his family was currently experiencing a catastrophic cyber failure. Every single server had been completely locked down by a massive ransomware attack. All of their corporate funds, client data, operational controls, and offshore accounts were entirely inaccessible. The screen displayed critical warning alerts indicating that their entire digital infrastructure had been hijacked and frozen. Kendrick's hands began to shake uncontrollably. The sleek, expensive smartphone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. He stared blankly at the shattered screen, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. "The servers," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "The servers are gone. The accounts are completely locked. Everything is gone." The Wall Street investors sitting at the nearby tables heard him. In their world, blood in the water is detected instantly. Dozens of elite guests immediately pulled out their own phones, checking financial news feeds and private market alerts. A low murmur spread through the ballroom as the guests began to realize that the groom's supposedly untouchable family fortune was currently imploding in real time. Paige turned to her new husband, looking annoyed. "Kendrick, what are you talking about?" she demanded. "Tell security to throw her out right now so we can cut the cake." I kept my posture completely relaxed, resting my hands on the table. I looked directly at my sister. Her beautiful designer gown and expensive jewelry could not hide the ugly reality of her character. "You know, Paige," I said calmly, keeping my voice steady and clear, so the surrounding tables could hear every word. "You saw me in a tactical vest outside a Beverly Hills mansion last week, and you automatically assumed I was a gate guard. You even rolled down the window of your leased sports car and threw a half-empty coffee cup at my boots while laughing with your friends. You called me a pathetic loser who peaked in high school." Paige stiffened, her eyes darting around the room as people listened in. "What you did not realize," I continued, "was that I was not standing there making minimum wage. I was personally inspecting the $5 million security grid I had just designed and installed for my own home. My company protects the physical and digital assets of people who have actual money, not people who just pretend to be rich on social media. While you were draining our parents' retirement accounts to pay for this fake billionaire wedding, I was acquiring commercial properties and building a global tech enterprise." Paige opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. The absolute certainty in my voice, combined with the unwavering respect of the security guards standing beside me, finally began to crack her delusion. She looked at the head of security, who was still glaring sternly at Kendrick, and then she looked back at me. Her face turned an ashen shade of gray as the horrifying truth began to settle into her mind. My father took a shaky step forward, pointing a trembling finger at me. "What have you done?" "Done, you ungrateful brat!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You fix whatever computer glitch you caused right now. You are going to ruin your sister's future." "I am not ruining anything," I replied simply. "I am just holding a mirror up to the truth. You spent my entire life calling me a failure and treating me like a disease. You kicked me out into the freezing rain when I was 19 because I wanted to code instead of going to medical school. You bet everything you had on the golden child and her supposedly wealthy groom. Now you get to live with the consequences of that investment." Kendrick suddenly lunged forward, his face twisted in desperate rage, but the hotel security guards instantly stepped between us, blocking his path. He strained against them, shouting that I was a criminal and demanding that I release his family's servers. Just as the chaos in the room reached a boiling point, a loud crash echoed from the back of the ballroom. The heavy, solid oak doors of the main entrance burst open with tremendous force, slamming against the walls. Everyone in the grand room stopped and turned toward the noise. Standing in the doorway was Winston, the 60-year-old billionaire father of the groom and the patriarch of the real estate dynasty. He was usually a man of impeccable style, always seen in crisp, tailored suits, with a composed and intimidating demeanor. But right now, he looked like a man who had just run through a hurricane. His expensive suit jacket was discarded. His tie was loosened and hanging crookedly around his neck. His dress shirt was soaked with sweat, and his chest heaved with heavy, desperate breaths. He looked absolutely frantic. He did not look at the beautiful floral arrangements or the terrified guests. He did not even look at his son Kendrick, who was standing near my table. Winston's wild, panicked eyes scanned the massive ballroom, searching frantically for one specific person. He pushed forcefully past the wealthy socialites and confused relatives, shoving his own family members out of the way as he sprinted across the marble floor directly toward my table. Winston did not stop to greet his wealthy friends. He did not acknowledge the lavish wedding decorations or the 300 elite guests staring at him in utter bewilderment. He shoved past a towering arrangement of white orchids, knocking a silver tray out of a waiter's hand. The crash of silverware against the marble floor echoed sharply, but Winston did not even blink. His entire focus was locked on me. Kendrick stepped forward, his chest puffed out, thinking his powerful father had arrived to save the day. "Dad." "Thank God you are here," Kendrick said, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "This crazy woman is trying to ruin my wedding. Tell security to throw her out." Winston did not slow down. He did not offer his son a reassuring smile or a word of support. Instead, he raised his arm and shoved Kendrick out of the way with such brutal force that the groom stumbled backward into a cocktail table. Winston reached table 42 and came to a dead halt. This was a man who routinely intimidated senators and commanded massive corporate boardrooms with just a look. He was a billionaire real estate mogul who demanded absolute respect wherever he went. But right now, his hands were trembling. He took a ragged, gasping breath, and then he did the unthinkable. He bent forward at the waist and bowed deeply right in front of my chair. "Miss Blair," Winston gasped, his voice hoarse and carrying across the dead silent ballroom. "I signed them. I signed the emergency asset transfer papers 5 minutes ago. My legal team just sent the digital copies directly to your chief operating officer. Please, I am begging you, restore our servers. Give us back our operational control. We surrender." The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. The hedge fund managers and Wall Street executives sitting at the nearby tables leaned in completely stunned. In the cutthroat world of commercial real estate, Winston was known as an apex predator. To see him bowing and begging for mercy from a woman sitting by the kitchen doors was a sight none of them could comprehend. Kendrick stood up from where he had stumbled, his face twisting in a mix of horror and profound embarrassment. He could not process the reality of the situation. His brain simply refused to accept that his invincible father was surrendering to the woman he had just mocked. "Dad, get up!" Kendrick shouted, marching back over and grabbing his father tightly by the shoulder. "What is wrong with you? Have you lost your mind? Stop bowing to her. She is a nobody. She is just a pathetic reject who checks identification cards at a gate. Get up before you humiliate our entire family in front of my guests." Winston snapped. The sheer ignorance of his son pushed him over the edge. He spun around and delivered a massive open-handed slap directly across Kendrick's face. The sharp, explosive crack of the impact rang out like a gunshot in the cavernous ballroom. The force of the blow lifted Kendrick off his feet. He crumpled, falling hard onto the polished marble floor, his expensive custom tuxedo bunching up around him. He grabbed his jaw, looking up at his father with wide, terrified eyes. "You ignorant fool!" Winston roared, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and absolute fury. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to? She is not a reject. She is not a gate guard. She is the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Vanguard." Winston pointed a shaking finger down at his son, while looking around at the guests, making sure everyone understood the gravity of the situation. "We were breached, Kendrick. Our entire corporate infrastructure was compromised by a ransomware syndicate. She is the only one who stopped the hackers from wiping our data permanently. And to secure her services, I had to leverage everything we have. She bought out all our failing creditors this morning. She holds 80% of our family's debt. Do you understand me? She owns our company. She owns the properties. She owns us." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The whispers started immediately spreading like wildfire from table to table. The elite guests were now looking at me not with pity or amusement, but with profound reverence and fear. The woman sitting by the swinging kitchen doors was not a poor relative looking for a free meal. I was the apex predator who had just swallowed a dynasty whole. My mother, Catherine, stood frozen near the VIP table. All the color had drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her mouth was open in a silent scream of realization. The crystal champagne glass she had been holding slipped right out of her manicured fingers. It hit the marble floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces, sending expensive champagne splashing across her designer shoes. She did not even notice. She was staring at me, remembering the night she had thrown me out into the freezing rain, calling me a failure. My father, William, looked like he had stopped breathing entirely. He gripped the back of a chair to keep himself upright, his knuckles turning white. The brilliant tech career he had called garbage had just bought the family he had been desperately trying to impress. But the most spectacular reaction belonged to my sister Paige. Paige stood a few feet away, looking down at her new husband, who was still cowering on the floor. She looked at her furious father-in-law, sweating and bowing. Then she looked at me sitting calmly in my seat, surrounded by the heavily armed hotel security guards who answered only to me. The grand illusion she had built her entire life upon was disintegrating before her eyes. The billionaire groom she had married was effectively broke. The golden child status she had weaponized against me meant absolutely nothing. The blood vanished from Paige's face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. Her eyes rolled back into her head. Her knees buckled beneath the weight of her massive $15,000 silk wedding gown. Without a single word, she collapsed, falling forward and fainting dead away onto the cold, hard floor of my hotel. The heavy thud of my sister hitting the polished marble floor echoed through the grand ballroom. Paige lay perfectly still, her $15,000 designer wedding gown pooled around her like a deflated parachute. The sheer shock of realizing that her billionaire groom was completely broke, and that her despised older sister owned everything, had simply short-circuited her brain. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The 300 elite guests remained frozen in their seats, staring at the unconscious bride. Kendrick was still sitting on the floor, rubbing his jaw where his father had struck him, looking utterly pathetic. He did not even crawl over to check on his new wife. He just stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding the magnitude of the mistake he had made. My father, William, was the first to break the silence. He dropped to his knees next to Paige, shouting for a doctor. He looked wildly around the room, panic radiating from every pore. The hotel staff, including the servers and the event coordinators, did not immediately rush forward. Instead, they all looked directly at me, waiting for my instruction. I gave a brief, subtle nod. My property, my rules. A hotel medic immediately stepped out from the hallway carrying a first aid kit. He knelt beside Paige and snapped a small capsule of smelling salts under her nose. The sharp, acrid scent filled the air. Paige gasped violently, taking a ragged breath, and her eyes fluttered open. For a split second, she looked confused. Then the memories of the last 5 minutes hit her all over again. She scrambled into a sitting position, clutching the heavy silk of her ruined dress. She looked at Winston, who was still standing near my table, sweating and defeated. She looked at Kendrick, cowering on the floor. Finally, she looked at me, sitting calmly behind my water glass, flanked by armed security. "Tell me it is a joke!" Paige sobbed, her voice cracking hysterically. "Kendrick, tell me she is lying. Tell me your father is playing a trick. Tell me we are still rich." Kendrick could not even look her in the eye. He looked down at the marble floor, his silence confirming every single one of her worst fears. Paige buried her face in her hands and began to wail an ugly, guttural sound that completely shattered the elegant atmosphere of the luxury wedding. The Wall Street investors at the surrounding tables were already typing furiously on their phones. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were messaging their firms to pull out of any pending deals with Kendrick's family. In high society, loyalty only lasts as long as the money does. It was then that my mother, Catherine, decided to play her hand. I watched her face transform. The sheer horror and disgust that had been plastered across her features just moments ago vanished. It was replaced by a sickeningly sweet, calculated smile. She realized that the daughter she had thrown away was now a billionaire, while the daughter she had worshipped was legally tied to a fraud. In her mind, the solution was simple. She just needed to switch teams. Catherine stepped carefully over the shattered glass of her dropped champagne flute, ignoring my sobbing sister entirely. She walked straight toward table 42, holding her hands out toward me as if she were approaching a lost child. "Blair, my brilliant daughter," Catherine said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. She tried to project her words so the wealthy guests could hear her, attempting to salvage her social standing in real time. "I always knew you were special. I always knew you had this incredible potential inside you." I sat perfectly still, watching her approach. She reached out, trying to grab my hands, but I pulled them back, resting them smoothly in my lap. The head of security took a half step forward, ready to intervene, but I held up a hand to stop him. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of delusion she was about to spin. "We pushed you." Catherine continued, her smile straining as she tried to ignore my cold rejection. "Your father and I were hard on you because we saw your genius. We knew that if we gave you a comfortable life, you would never push yourself to achieve greatness. All of that tough love, it was to build your character. Look at what you have accomplished. We are so incredibly proud of our self-made billionaire." The sheer audacity of her lie was almost breathtaking. She was actually trying to claim credit for the empire I had built out of my own blood, sweat, and tears. I stood up from my chair. I smoothed down the silk of my dress, ignoring the dark red wine stain she had caused just minutes earlier. I looked down at my mother, and the fake smile instantly melted right off her face. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice low and dangerous, but carrying a commanding weight that made her physically recoil. "You did not push me to succeed, Catherine. You tried to bury me so Paige could shine." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, backing her away from my table. "Do you remember the night I turned 19? I asked, projecting my voice so every guest in that ballroom could hear the ugly truth. It was raining and freezing outside. I begged you and William to co-sign a tiny student loan so I could afford to eat while taking my coding classes. You refused. You packed my meager belongings into 3 black garbage bags and threw them out onto the wet driveway. You locked the door and turned off the porch light. You told me I was a failure, a parasite, and a waste of space. You told me to never come back until I learned my place." My mother swallowed hard, looking around nervously as the elite crowd judged her. "Blair, please," she whispered, trying to keep the conversation quiet now. "People are staring. Family matters should stay private." "You lost the right to call me family the second you locked that door," I replied, ice coding every single syllable. "You do not get to claim my success. We share DNA, but we are absolutely nothing to each other." I turned my back on her, leaving her standing there, humiliated and exposed. I shifted my attention back to Winston. The powerful real estate mogul was still waiting for my verdict. He looked completely broken, a man watching his entire life's work hang by a single fragile thread. "Winston," I said, addressing him with total professional detachment, "your legal team sent the paperwork. You have surrendered the controlling shares and offered full compliance. Because of that, I will show you mercy." Winston let out a massive, trembling sigh of relief. He closed his eyes and nodded repeatedly. "Thank you, Miss Blair. Thank you. I accept the surrender of your assets." I continued, raising my hand to signal my security team. "My engineers are unlocking your servers right now. Your corporate funds will be accessible within the hour. However, the deal has a new condition attached to it." Winston opened his eyes, looking at me with nervous anticipation. "Anything," he said quickly. "Whatever you want." I looked down at Kendrick, who was still sitting on the floor, looking up at me with a mixture of hatred and fear. Then I looked back at Winston. "Cut your son off entirely," I demanded. "Strip his title, freeze his personal trust, and remove his access to your family's accounts. He gets nothing. Aegis Vanguard does not fund entitlement, and I will not do business with a company that employs a man who treats my staff like garbage." Kendrick scrambled to his feet, his designer tuxedo rumpled, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me, and then turned his fury on his father. "You cannot do this to me!" he screamed, his voice breaking as it echoed across the quiet ballroom. "You cannot just cut me off because this woman told you to. I am your son. I am the future of this family. I am the heir to the entire commercial real estate empire." Winston looked at his son with a mixture of profound disgust and utter exhaustion. The older man straightened his posture, pulling back his shoulders with the heavy dignity of a self-made mogul who had just watched his legacy be trampled into the dirt. "There is no empire left for you to inherit, you arrogant fool!" Winston fired back, his deep voice rolling through the room like thunder. "Did you honestly think I was blind? Did you think I would not find out what you were doing behind my back?" Kendrick froze. The angry red flush on his cheeks instantly vanished, replaced by a sickly pale white. He took a hesitant step backward, swallowing hard. "What are you talking about, Dad? I have not done anything." "Stop lying to me!" Winston roared, stepping forward and jabbing a finger into his son's chest. "When Miss Blair and her team at Aegis Vanguard were locking down our servers to block the hackers, they had to run a full diagnostic on our internal financial systems. They bypassed the encrypted firewalls you set up. They found the shell companies, Kendrick. They found the offshore accounts." A heavy collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Hedge fund managers and socialites leaned in closer, their eyes wide with shock. Winston did not hold back. He aired his son's dirty laundry right in front of the very high society crowd Kendrick had been so desperate to impress. "You embezzled $12 million from your own family," Winston continued, his voice shaking with absolute betrayal. "You drained our operational capital to fund your sports cars, your private jet leases, and this ridiculously lavish fake billionaire wedding. You are not an heir. You are a thief. You destroyed the liquidity of my company just so you could play a rich man on social media." Paige, who had just managed to pull herself up from the marble floor, let out a high-pitched shriek. She grabbed Kendrick by his tuxedo jacket, shaking him violently. "Is this true?" she screamed, her face contorted with panic. "Tell me he is lying, Kendrick. You told me you had a $200 million trust fund. You told me you owned those penthouses. Are you telling me you are broke?" Kendrick shoved her hands away, refusing to look her in the eye. "Shut up, Paige," he hissed. "Just shut up." The confirmation hit the room like a physical shockwave. The wealthy guests began whispering frantically among themselves, realizing they had flown in to celebrate a massive financial fraud. But the most spectacular reaction came from my parents. My father, William, suddenly let out a strangled, gasping sound. He clutched his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. He stumbled forward, pushing past Paige and grabbing Kendrick roughly by the arm. "What about the waterfront development project?" my father demanded, his voice rising to a frantic, panicked pitch. "Kendrick, look at me right now. What about the exclusive investment opportunity you offered us?" Kendrick tried to pull his arm away, looking like a trapped rat. "William, calm down," he said, avoiding my father's wild eyes. "That money is locked up in escrow. It is perfectly safe. It is just tied up in the development phase." Liar, Winston bellowed, stepping closer to his son. "There is no waterfront development project, William. My company scrapped those blueprints 3 years ago. If you gave this boy any money, he funneled it directly into his own personal debts." My mother, Catherine, let out a piercing wail that shattered the last remaining shreds of her country club dignity. She grabbed her hair, pacing back and forth in absolute hysterics. "William, tell me we did not give him everything," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Tell me you kept the safety net." My father looked at her with tears of pure terror welling in his eyes. "We gave him everything, Catherine," he whispered, his voice breaking entirely. "We completely liquidated our entire retirement portfolio. We took out a second mortgage on the house. We gave him $1.2 million just 2 days ago so we could secure our status as VIP investors before the wedding." Paige let out another horrified shriek, realizing that her parents were now effectively destitute. The golden child had married a fraudster, and the parents had bankrupted themselves to buy a ticket to the show. The pristine, wealthy image my family had spent their entire lives cultivating had just burned to ashes in under 5 minutes. They were ruined. I sat back in my chair, feeling the cool, smooth glass of my water goblet under my fingertips. I looked at the three of them, trembling, crying, and turning on each other in the middle of the grand ballroom. I felt absolutely no sympathy. I only felt a deep, resonant sense of closure. I picked up my glass of $20,000 vintage wine, taking a slow, deliberate sip. I let the rich, dark flavor settle before I lowered the glass and looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "That money is gone, William," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the chaos and silencing their panicked sobbing. You handed your entire life savings to a fraudster just to buy a front row seat to my humiliation. The absolute finality of my words struck my father like a physical blow. William stumbled backward, his hands grasping at the empty air before he caught the edge of a chair to steady himself. His face had transformed from a mask of arrogant superiority into a portrait of complete and utter despair. He had just realized that his obsessive pursuit of high society status had cost him every single penny he had ever earned. My mother, Catherine, was no better. She fell to her knees on the marble floor, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. The pristine country club image she had spent decades cultivating was entirely obliterated in a matter of seconds. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for them. They were finally experiencing the exact same cold and helpless reality they had forced upon me when I was 19 years old. I turned my attention away from my sobbing parents and looked out over the massive ballroom. The lavish floral arrangements, the towering crystal centerpieces, the tier cake sitting untouched on a silver table. It was a monument to fake wealth and toxic entitlement. I looked at the head of security, who was still standing at attention near my table. I gave him a brief, firm nod. "This wedding is officially cancelled," I announced, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "Clear the venue." The security chief immediately tapped his earpiece and relayed the order. Within seconds, a coordinated team of hotel security guards and my own personal Aegis Vanguard operatives moved seamlessly through the ballroom. They were polite but incredibly firm as they began directing the 300 elite guests toward the main exit doors. "Ladies and gentlemen, the event has concluded," the guards repeated systematically. "Please gather your belongings and proceed to the exits." There was no resistance from the crowd. In fact, the wealthy socialites and Wall Street executives could not get out of the room fast enough. In their world, associating with a publicly exposed fraudster was social and financial suicide. They grabbed their expensive coats and designer clutches, whispering furiously to one another as they rushed toward the doors. I could hear snippets of their conversations as they hurried past my table. They were already making calls to their brokers and lawyers, ensuring their own assets were completely insulated from Kendrick and his impending legal nightmare. As the massive ballroom rapidly emptied, the polished veneer of the fairy tale wedding completely shattered, Paige and Kendrick were left standing in the center of the room, surrounded by half-empty tables and discarded napkins. The romantic facade they had maintained all evening evaporated, replaced instantly by vicious, toxic hatred. Paige turned on her new husband, her face contorted with a kind of ugly fury I had never seen before. "You lied to me," she screamed, shoving him hard in the chest with both hands. "You told me you were a billionaire. You promised me penthouses and private jets. You are nothing but a broke, pathetic criminal. You stole my parents' money." Kendrick did not hold back. Stripped of his wealthy persona, he unleashed his own venom. "Oh, shut up, Paige," he shouted right back at her, slapping her hands away. "You never loved me. You only loved the credit limit you thought I had. You are a shallow, greedy gold digger who just wanted a free ride. We deserve each other because you are just as fake as I am." "How dare you!" Paige shrieked. Her voice echoed shrilly through the emptying room. "I could have married anyone. I turned down real money for you because you promised me a dynasty. You ruined my life." Kendrick let out a cruel, barking laugh. "You ruined your own life the second you believed you were actually special. The only reason anyone is even looking at you right now is because your sister owns the building." Their shouting match degraded into a vicious public spectacle. Paige ripped off her expensive veil and threw it directly at Kendrick's face. She screamed every profanity she could think of, cursing him and his entire family. Kendrick yelled back, mocking her parents for being stupid enough to hand over their life savings without running a single background check. It was a spectacular display of two terrible people realizing they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Winston, Kendrick's father, had already walked out in disgust, refusing to even look at his son as he exited the ballroom. My parents were still huddled near the VIP table, too paralyzed by their financial ruin to intervene in the fight. I remained seated at table 42, watching the chaos unfold with absolute tranquility. I took another sip of my vintage wine, enjoying the show. As the last few guests filtered out of the doors, Paige suddenly stopped screaming at Kendrick. Her chest heaved as she took ragged, angry breaths. She turned her head, and her furious, tear-streaked eyes locked directly onto me. In her twisted mind, Kendrick's lies were not the actual problem. The problem was that I had exposed them. I had stripped away her golden child status and humiliated her in front of the only society she cared about. The profound jealousy and hatred she had harbored for me her entire life boiled over into pure blind rage. "You did this," Paige shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You planned this just to destroy me." Before anyone could stop her, Paige hiked up the heavy skirts of her custom bridal gown and lunged across the space between us. She sprinted toward my table with her hands outstretched, aiming directly for my face. She wanted to physically hurt me, to make me bleed for ruining her perfect illusion. But I did not even flinch. I did not move a single muscle. Before Paige could get within 3 feet of my chair, two of my elite security operatives moved with lightning speed. They stepped flawlessly into her path, forming an impenetrable human wall. Paige slammed hard into the guards. She thrashed and kicked, screaming like a wild animal, desperately trying to claw her way past them to reach me. "Let me go," she wailed, fighting against their iron grip. "I am going to kill her. She ruined my life." The security guards easily intercepted her, restraining her arms and pushing her firmly backward to neutralize the threat. But Paige refused to stop fighting. She twisted violently, throwing her weight backward to break free. In the midst of the scuffle, the heavy, delicate train of her designer wedding gown caught sharply beneath the heavy tactical boot of one of the guards. As Paige threw her body backward, trying to pull away, the expensive fabric stretched tight. A loud, sharp tearing sound echoed through the quiet ballroom. The $15,000 custom silk dress snagged and ripped cleanly down the middle. The seam split from her waistline all the way down to the hem, exposing the cheap tulle underskirt beneath. Paige froze mid-scream. She looked down at the massive, jagged tear, destroying the most expensive garment she had ever owned. The symbol of her wealthy new life was now literally in tatters, hanging off her body in ruined shreds. She dropped to her knees, clutching the torn fabric, and let out a devastating, defeated sob. Paige knelt on the cold marble, clutching the shredded halves of her custom silk gown. Her devastating sobs echoed through the cavernous ballroom, but there was no one left to pity her. The elite guests had already vanished, leaving behind half-empty champagne flutes and the shattered illusion of her billionaire lifestyle. I stood up from table 42, smoothing out the skirt of my own dress. The dark wine stain my mother had caused was still there, but it no longer mattered. I looked at the security chief and gave him a final nod. "Escort them out," I commanded, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "And use the service doors. The front lobby is for paying guests only." My parents, William and Catherine, looked up in sheer horror. The service doors were the exact same swinging kitchen doors they had tried to banish me to just an hour ago. Now those heavy wooden doors were their only way out. The hotel security guard stepped forward, pulling Paige to her feet despite her wailing protests. They grabbed Kendrick by the arms, hauling him up from the floor where he had been standing, frozen in shock. My parents stumbled along behind them, too broken by their massive financial ruin to even put up a fight. I followed at a calm, measured pace, watching my family being marched through the bustling industrial kitchen. The kitchen staff stopped prepping food and stared as the sobbing bride in a torn dress and the disgraced groom were paraded past the stainless steel prep stations. But the real nightmare for my family was waiting just outside. As the heavy metal doors swung open and we stepped out into the freezing night air of the back alley, the flash of smartphone cameras instantly blinded them. Word of the catastrophic meltdown had spread faster than I could have anticipated. Dozens of the wealthy guests had not actually left the property. Instead, they had gathered near the valet stand and the service exits, holding up their phones. They had live-streamed the entire screaming match between Paige and Kendrick from the ballroom windows. The high society crowd my parents had worshipped their entire lives was now treating them like a roadside circus attraction. Catherine threw her hands over her face, letting out a high-pitched wail of absolute humiliation. William tried to shield her, but the damage was already done. In the age of social media, a scandal involving a fake billionaire and a ruined wedding was going to be the top trending topic before midnight. The country club elite were already laughing at them. My personal security team flanked me as I walked past the flashing cameras. A sleek, matte black armored Maybach pulled up to the curb, its heavy engine purring quietly in the cold night. My driver stepped out and opened the rear door for me. The plush heated leather interior looked like a sanctuary compared to the freezing concrete of the service alley. Blair, wait. The desperate, frantic voice belonged to my mother. Catherine broke away from my father and practically lunged toward my vehicle. My security guards immediately stepped in, blocking her path, but she stretched her arms out toward me, her face streaked with ruined mascara and tears. Please, Blair. Catherine begged, her teeth chattering in the freezing wind. You cannot just leave us here like this. The reporters will be here any minute. Everyone in our social circle is watching. They are going to destroy us. Please just give us a ride home. We have no money for a car. We have absolutely nothing left. I sat comfortably in the back seat of the Maybach. I pressed a button and the heavy tinted window rolled down with a smooth mechanical hum. The freezing wind rushed into the car, but I did not shiver. I looked at my mother, seeing the absolute desperation in her eyes. I remembered another freezing night 14 years ago. I remember standing on the wet driveway of your suburban house. I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that cut right through the howling wind. I was 19 years old. I had exactly $12 to my name. I begged you to let me sleep on the couch just for one night so I would not freeze. Do you remember what you said to me, Catherine? My mother swallowed hard, her lips trembling. Blair, please, she wept. You told me that having a college dropout in your house would give the neighbors something to gossip about. I continued, refusing to let her look away. You cared more about country club gossip when I had to choose between textbooks and groceries. You cared about your reputation more than my survival. So now you get to worry about your reputation while you stand in the freezing cold. I leaned back into the warmth of the leather seat. Walk, I commanded. I pressed the button and the tinted window rolled up seamlessly, cutting off her frantic sobbing. But before my driver could pull away, the sharp, wailing sound of police sirens pierced the night air. Red and blue lights flashed aggressively around the corner, illuminating the service alley in harsh, strobing colors. 3 police cruisers screeched to a halt right next to the valet stand, blocking the exit. Several uniformed officers jumped out of the vehicles, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. They marched directly toward the group of wealthy guests and the remnants of my family. Kendrick, my sister's fraudulent groom, took one look at the approaching officers and tried to make a run for it. He bolted toward the side street, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the icy pavement. He did not make it 10 feet. 2 officers tackled him to the ground, pressing his face into the cold, wet concrete. Kendrick, you are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud and grand larceny, one of the officers shouted, pulling Kendrick's arms behind his back and snapping heavy metal handcuffs onto his wrists. Paige stood a few feet away, clutching her ripped dress, her mouth hanging open in sheer terror. She watched as her husband, the man who was supposed to give her a dynasty, was dragged up from the ground like a common thief. Winston, the powerful real estate mogul, stepped out from the shadows near the police cruisers. He had not gone home after bowing to me in the ballroom. Winston walked over and looked down at his handcuffed son with a mixture of disgust and absolute resignation. I told them everything, Winston said, his deep voice carrying over the sound of the sirens. I handed over the ledgers and the offshore account numbers. I am not letting you take down the rest of this family because of your greed. Winston had actually called the police on his own son. He had turned Kendrick in to the authorities for federal wire fraud just to appease my conditions and save his company from total liquidation. He knew that Aegis Vanguard would show zero mercy if he tried to protect a criminal, so he had offered his own son up on a silver platter. I watched Kendrick being shoved into the back of a police cruiser, kicking and screaming that he was an heir. I looked at Paige, trembling and alone in the freezing alley. I looked at my parents, completely broken and shivering as the flashing police lights illuminated their utter ruin. I tapped the partition glass, and my driver pulled the Maybach smoothly away from the curb, leaving the shattered remains of my toxic family exactly where they belonged. In the rearview mirror, they looked incredibly small. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, ruthless efficiency I had carefully engineered into every single aspect of my life. The penthouse office of Aegis Vanguard headquarters sat 60 floors above the city, operating as a fortress of reinforced glass, matte black steel, and state-of-the-art, biometric security checkpoints. The panoramic windows offered a sweeping, breathtaking view of the skyline, But my focus was entirely locked on the heavy mahogany table in the center of the room. Sitting directly across from me was Winston. The catastrophic events of the weekend had aged the powerful real estate mogul by at least a decade. The arrogant fire that usually defined his commanding presence was entirely extinguished. In its place was the grim, quiet resignation of a man who had been outplayed on every conceivable level. He held an engraved platinum fountain pen, hovering it over a thick stack of dense legal documents. These were not simple corporate contracts. They represented the unconditional surrender of his entire commercial real estate empire. "I spent 40 years building this portfolio," Winston said, his deep voice carrying a heavy, gravelly weight. "I started with one small apartment building in a red-line neighborhood. Now I am signing the controlling shares over to a 33-year-old cybersecurity expert just to cover my own son's criminal debts." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, keeping my expression strictly professional. "You are signing them over to save your legitimate employees from sudden unemployment, Winston. Kendrick's wire fraud would have triggered a massive federal freeze by tomorrow morning. I bought your debt to secure my leverage, but I am keeping your company afloat. Your legacy survives. It just belongs to Aegis Vanguard now." Winston nodded slowly, acknowledging the cold, hard truth of his situation. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name on the dotted lines. With those swift strokes of ink, my company officially absorbed billions of dollars in commercial assets. It was the largest and most aggressive acquisition I had ever orchestrated. As Winston slid the finalized portfolio across the desk, a soft chime echoed from the discreet communication console built into my workstation. "Boss," the voice of Damon, my head of security, filled the quiet office. "We have a situation down in the main lobby. It is your family. They are refusing to leave." I tapped a button on my console and a large high-definition display projected seamlessly onto the glass wall to my right. The live security feed from the ground floor lobby flickered to life. The sight was almost pathetic enough to make me laugh out loud. Down in the pristine minimalist lobby of my corporate headquarters stood William, Catherine, and Paige. They looked absolutely unhinged. They were still wearing the exact same clothes they had slept in. Paige had a gray hoodie over the shredded remains of her $15,000 silk wedding gown. Her expensive bridal makeup was smeared in dark, chaotic streaks down her pale cheeks, making her look like a deranged raccoon. Catherine was physically pounding her fists against the bulletproof glass of the security turnstiles, screaming at the impassive guards. William was red-faced and sweating aggressively, pointing his finger at a receptionist and demanding to be granted immediate access because he was the father of the chief executive officer. Winston looked up at the security feed and shook his head in profound disgust. "That family," he muttered under his breath, "is a disease. They fed my son's worst delusions just to buy their way into high society." "They are about to learn how high society actually operates," I replied smoothly. "Should I have local law enforcement remove them for trespassing?" Damon asked over the intercom. I watched my mother kick the security barrier in a fit of childish rage. "No, Damon," I instructed. "Let them up. But do not bring them into my office. Put them in the glass holding room." The glass holding room was a specialized architectural feature located directly across the hall from my main office doors. It was designed entirely out of transparent, reinforced smart glass. It allowed visitors to see the immense scale of my operation while keeping them physically and acoustically isolated until I was ready to deal with them. I watched on the feed as the armed security guards approached my screaming family. The moment the guards gestured toward the private executive elevators, my parents' demeanor instantly shifted. Catherine quickly tried to smooth down her wrinkled dress, puffing out her chest. William adjusted his collar, looking suddenly smug. They actually believed that their public tantrum had worked. They genuinely thought I was bringing them up for a tearful family reunion and a generous financial bailout. Winston stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "I will take my leave through the private helipad exit, Miss Blair. I have no desire to breathe the same air as those parasites." "A wise choice, Winston. My team will be in touch regarding the restructuring protocol." As Winston departed, the heavy elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open. My security team escorted William, Catherine, and Paige out, stepping them directly into the transparent holding room. The heavy glass door locked behind them with an audible magnetic click. From my desk, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the three of them. They rushed to the glass wall expecting me to come out and greet them. William started speaking loudly, gesturing toward me, but the soundproof engineering of the room completely muted his voice. He was just a silent, frantic mime trapped in a very expensive cage. I pressed a button on my desk, activating the one-way visibility feature. They could see me perfectly, but they could not hear a single thing I was doing. I did not acknowledge them. I did not even look at them. Instead, I picked up my phone and began my workday. For the next 2 solid hours, I left my family locked inside that transparent box. I had my assistant bring me a fresh artisan espresso. I conducted 3 high-level video conferences with international tech executives. I reviewed million-dollar merger agreements and casually signed contracts that shaped the global market. Every time I glanced up, I saw them standing there pressing their hands against the glass. The smug entitlement they had brought up in the elevator slowly evaporated. It was replaced by a creeping, suffocating realization of their own utter insignificance. They were forced to stand there in their dirty, rumpled clothes, watching the daughter they had thrown away rule a world they could never even dream of entering. They had spent 33 years trying to make me feel small. Now I was making them wait in a glass box while I casually conquered the world. 2 full hours passed before I finally reached over and tapped the biometric sensor on my desk console. A soft chime echoed in the hallway, and the heavy magnetic lock on the glass holding room disengaged. The thick, transparent door slowly swung open. My security team stepped forward, gesturing for my family to finally enter my main executive office. They walked in looking like a trio of refugees who had just wandered off the street. The contrast between my pristine corporate fortress and their current state was staggering. My father William tried to adjust his wrinkled suit jacket, attempting to project authority, but his posture was completely defeated. My mother Catherine looked haggard, her eyes red and puffy from crying over her lost country club status. Paige trailed behind them, dragging her ripped silk gown beneath her cheap oversized hoodie, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. William marched up to my massive mahogany desk, placing his hands flat on the polished surface. He took a deep breath, clearly trying to summon the patriarchal dominance he had used to control our family for decades. "Blair, this little power trip of yours ends right now," William demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You have made your point. You are wealthy and successful. We get it. But Kendrick stole $1.2 million from us. We liquidated our entire retirement portfolio and took out a second mortgage on the house just to secure our status for this wedding. We are facing absolute financial ruin. You need to fix this." I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers. "I need to fix this," I repeated calmly. "And why exactly is your terrible financial decision my responsibility?" "Because we are your parents!" Catherine cried out, stepping forward and clutching her hands together against her chest. "We raised you, Blair. We gave you a home. We put food on the table and clothes on your back. We sacrificed so much to give you a foundation in life. You owe us for everything we provided. Family takes care of family. You have billions of dollars now. 1.2 million is nothing to you. You can write a check right now and save us from bankruptcy." Paige finally looked up from the floor, her face twisted in a bitter scowl. "Just give them the money," Blair. Paige snapped, her voice hoarse from screaming at her fraudulent groom the night before. "You are only doing this to punish me because you have always been jealous of me. Just pay them back so we can all go home and forget this nightmare ever happened." I looked at my sister, completely unfazed by her pathetic outburst. Then I looked back at my parents. They were actually trying to weaponize familial guilt after throwing me out into the freezing rain 14 years ago. They genuinely believed that providing the bare minimum legal requirements of childhood entitled them to my hard-earned fortune. I opened the top drawer of my desk. I bypassed the stacks of multi-million-dollar contracts and reached into the very back. I pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger. I placed it squarely in the center of the desk, right in front of William. "What is this?" William asked, staring down at the worn leather book. "That is an itemized accounting of my childhood," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The day you threw me out of your house at 19 years old, I started keeping a record. I calculated the exact cost of the hand-me-down clothes you forced me to wear while buying Page designer brands. I calculated the cost of the basic groceries I consumed. I calculated a prorated share of the utility bills for the tiny drafty bedroom I was allowed to sleep in. I even calculated the cost of the basic medical care you were legally obligated to provide until I was 18. Catherine stared at me, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. You kept a receipt for your childhood, she whispered. I kept a ledger, Catherine, I corrected her. Because you spent my entire life reminding me of what a burden I was. You never let me forget exactly how much I cost you. You told me I was an expensive disappointment, so I made sure to track every single penny you ever wasted on me. I ran the final numbers last night while you were sleeping in your ruined wedding clothes. I even applied a generous market interest rate to account for inflation over the last 14 years. I opened my desk drawer again and pulled out my personal checkbook. I uncapped my fountain pen and began to write. The only sound in the massive penthouse office was the sharp scratch of the metal nib against the paper. I filled out the date, the recipient names, and the exact numerical value. I tore the check from the book and slid it smoothly across the mahogany desk, coming to rest right on top of the leather ledger. William reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the piece of paper. He stared at the amount written there. $42,500. William read aloud, his voice cracking with outrage. What is this? This is an insult. This does not even cover a fraction of the $1.2 million we lost to Kendrick. How are we supposed to survive on this? I stood up from my chair, planting my hands firmly on the desk and leaning toward them. That check is not to cover your bad investment, William. That check is the exact refund for my childhood. My parents stared at me in stunned silence as the reality of my words washed over them. With that payment, we are now entirely even. I declared, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I have reimbursed you for the food, the shelter, and the bare minimum existence you provided. We are now financially and biologically severed. I owe you absolutely nothing. I am no longer your daughter and you are no longer my parents. You are just three strangers standing in my office. Catherine burst into fresh tears, covering her face as she sobbed. Paige stared at the check, shaking her head in denial. William looked completely broken, the check trembling in his hand. However, I continued, standing up straight and looking directly at my former father. I know that the bank is going to call in the second mortgage on your house by the end of the week. You gave all your liquid cash to a fraudster, so foreclosure is imminent. You are about to lose the only roof you have left over your heads. But if you want to avoid foreclosure and absolute homelessness, you have exactly one option. My parents leaned forward, pressing their hands against the edge of my massive mahogany desk. Their eyes were wide with a pathetic, desperate kind of hope. After everything I had just said to them, after clearly severing our biological and financial ties, they still genuinely believed I was going to throw them a lifeline. They thought I was going to hand them a magic solution to save their precious country club lifestyle. William gripped the polished wood, his knuckles turning white. "What is the option, Blair?" he asked, his voice trembling with eager anticipation. "Tell us what we need to do to fix this mess." I tapped my fountain pen against the leather ledger, assessing the sheer depth of their delusion. I had my corporate acquisitions team contact the bank holding the second mortgage on your house early this morning, I explained. Because you missed your primary payments to fund Kendrick's fraudulent investment scheme, the bank is preparing to seize the property. By Friday afternoon, your names will be on a public foreclosure list. Your credit will be permanently destroyed, and you will be facing massive legal penalties. Catherine gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. The public foreclosure list. She whimpered, her voice cracking. All our friends will see it. The entire neighborhood will know we are broke. We will be ruined in this city. You are already ruined, Catherine, I reminded her coldly. But I am offering you a clean break. I have drafted an immediate purchase agreement. I will buy the house from you today. I will pay off the bank entirely, covering your massive defaulted mortgage and clearing your names from the bad debt registry. You will avoid the legal nightmare of a highly publicized public bankruptcy. William let out a massive, heavy sigh of relief. His posture instantly relaxed, and a sickeningly familiar, arrogant smile began to creep back onto his face. He actually thought he had won. He thought he had successfully manipulated his billionaire daughter into saving his suburban mansion. He looked at Catherine and gave her a reassuring nod, as if he had just executed a brilliant business negotiation. I knew you would see reason, Blair Williams said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. It is a beautiful house. It is a great real asset for your growing portfolio. We can stay there and maintain the property for you to keep it looking perfect. We can even host charity events for your company in the backyard. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but pity for his towering ignorance. You misunderstand me, William, I said, my voice dropping to a dead flat tone. I am buying the property. That means I own the deed. And because I own the deed, I am formally serving you with a 72-hour notice to vacate. The arrogant smile vanished from his face, as if it had been physically slapped away. What he stammered, his eyes darting around the room. You have exactly 72 hours to pack whatever fits in the trunks of your cars and leave, I instructed. Anything left inside the house after that strict deadline will be considered abandoned property and will be destroyed. Destroyed! Catherine shrieked, gripping the edge of the desk so hard her fingernails dug into the wood. What are you talking about? It is a custom-built luxury home. You cannot just kick us out into the street. Where are we supposed to go? You can take that $42,000 refund check sitting right in front of you and rent a very modest apartment, I suggested smoothly. It should cover a security deposit and a few months of rent in a low-income neighborhood if you budget carefully. Just remember to turn off the lights when you leave the room. Utilities can be quite expensive these days. But why would you kick us out? William demanded, his face turning bright red with fresh anger. If you are buying the house as a real estate investment, why evict us? I am not keeping the house as an investment, I clarified. I already filed the commercial demolition permits. The bulldozers and wrecking crews are scheduled to arrive on Monday morning. I am going to tear that house down to the very foundation. I am going to completely erase it from the neighborhood. Catherine let out a horrified sob, stepping back from the desk. You are going to demolish our beautiful home. Why would you do something so spiteful? Because I am building something better, I said, leaning back in my leather chair. I am clearing the entire lot to build a massive state-of-the-art youth center. It is going to be a fully funded charity sanctuary for teenagers who have been kicked out of their homes by toxic, abusive parents. It will be a safe place with warm beds and hot meals for kids who have nowhere else to go. Kids exactly like I was 14 years ago. I am going to build a fortress of support right on top of the very soil where you made me feel worthless. The poetic justice of the plan struck them like a physical blow. The house they loved more than their own daughter was going to be destroyed and replaced by a monument to their terrible parenting. Their wealthy, snooty neighbors would have to watch a charity center rise from the rubble of their ruined social status. Paige, who had been standing silently in her ruined wedding dress and oversized hoodie, finally snapped. The reality of her new life crashed down on her all at once. You cannot do this to me, Blair, Paige screamed, stepping forward and slamming her hands on my desk. You cannot leave me homeless. Kendrick is sitting in a federal holding cell. His father, Winston, completely cut us off and froze all our shared accounts. I have absolutely nothing left. I do not have a car. I do not have a trust fund. I have never worked a day in my life. You have to give me a job at your company. You owe me an executive position. I looked at my younger sister, taking in her smeared makeup and her wild, desperate eyes. The golden child who had spent 29 years treating me like a peasant was now begging me for a paycheck. I do not owe you anything, Paige, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly calm. An Aegis Vanguard only hires highly skilled technical professionals. We do not employ people whose only talent is spending other people's money. Then what am I supposed to do? Paige wailed, tears streaming down her face. How am I supposed to survive? I opened a different drawer in my desk. I reached inside and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. I placed it on the desk and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany until it stopped right in front of Paige. She looked down at it, her eyes widening in pure absolute horror. It was a standard employment application for a local fast food chain. Start flipping burgers, Paige, I said. The single sheet of paper sat on the polished mahogany desk like a death sentence. Paige stared down at the brightly colored logo of the local fast food chain printed at the top of the employment application. Her eyes darted rapidly across the fields, asking for her previous work experience and her availability for night shifts. Her hands began to shake violently. The oversized gray hoodie she wore slipped off one shoulder, exposing the jagged, ripped edge of her ruined wedding gown. For 29 years, my sister had coasted through life on a wave of pure, unearned entitlement. She had never applied for a job. She had never worked a single day to support herself. She had simply existed as the golden child waiting to be handed her next reward. Now the universe had finally handed her the bill. "I am not taking this," Paige whispered, her voice quivering with a potent mix of terror and absolute denial. "I am not working a deep fryer, Blair. I am supposed to be a billionaire wife. I am supposed to be a socialite. You cannot make me do this." "I am not making you do anything, Paige," I replied, keeping my posture relaxed. "I am simply offering you a realistic starting point for your new life. You have no money. Your husband is sitting in a federal holding cell. Your parents are broke and about to be homeless. You need an income. I highly recommend filling out the references section carefully." William reached out and gently grabbed Paige by the arm, his face pale and defeated. "Come on, Paige," my father murmured, his voice hollow. "We need to go. We have to figure out how to pack the house before the demolition crew arrives." But Paige ripped her arm away from him. She planted her feet firmly on the carpet of my penthouse office and refused to move. The sheer panic in her eyes slowly hardened, morphing into a dark, vicious fury. The facade of the innocent, perfect daughter completely melted away, leaving behind the ugly, bitter truth of who she really was. "No!" Paige screamed, her voice cracking as it echoed off the glass walls of my corporate fortress. "I am not leaving here. I am not going back to pack boxes like some peasant. I deserve better than this." She stepped closer to my desk, planting both hands flat on the polished wood. She leaned forward, her face contorted with a toxic, venomous rage. "You think you are so smart," Blair, Paige hissed, spitting the words out like poison. "You think you figured everything out. You think Mom and Dad just naturally hated you because you were different. You have no idea what actually happened in that house, do you?" I looked at her, maintaining my absolute stoic indifference. "Enlighten me," I said. Paige let out a cruel, jagged laugh. "It was not natural, Blair. I made them hate you. I orchestrated every single bit of it." William and Catherine gasped, staring at their golden child in absolute shock. But Paige did not care about them anymore. She only cared about tearing me down. "I always knew you were smarter than me," Paige confessed, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "Even when we were kids, I saw the way you figured things out. I saw you building computers, writing code, doing things I could not even understand. You were a genius, and I was just pretty. I knew that if Mom and Dad ever actually paid attention to you, they would realize how completely average I was. I could not let that happen. I needed to be the only success in the house. I needed all the resources, all the praise, all the money." She gripped the edge of my desk, her knuckles turning stark white. "So I planted the seeds." Paige continued, her eyes wild with desperate malice. "Every time you achieved something, I threw a tantrum until they ignored you to comfort me. I told them you were stealing my things so they would ground you. When you got accepted into those advanced tech programs, I told Mom you were doing it just to embarrass the family because it was not a traditional career. I manipulated every conversation. I made you the villain of every story. I turned you into the enemy so they would kick you out and leave the entire inheritance for me. I did it on purpose, Blair. I destroyed your childhood just so I could win." She stood there panting heavily, waiting for my reaction. She wanted to see me break. She wanted to see the devastation on my face. She wanted to know that her confession had finally shattered the icy armor I had built around myself. She wanted to prove that she still had the power to hurt me. I sat perfectly still. I did not blink. I did not frown. I looked at my sister, feeling a profound, absolute emptiness. Her confession did not heal me. It did not bring me closure. It simply validated my indifference. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that cutting this toxic family out of my life was the most brilliant business decision I had ever made. "Is that supposed to hurt my feelings, Paige?" I asked, my voice smooth and dead flat. Paige froze, her manic expression faltering. "Because all you just did was explain why you are currently standing in front of me, wearing a ruined dress and begging for scraps." I continued. "You spent 29 years playing manipulative games in a suburban living room, while I spent 14 years building a global empire. Your jealousy was your own poison, Paige, and now you get to choke on it. You won the battle for their attention, but you completely lost the war. Look at them. I gestured to William and Catherine, who were standing near the door looking completely shattered by the realization that their golden child had played them for absolute fools their entire lives. "You won 2 bankrupt parents and a one-way ticket to poverty," I said. "Congratulations on your massive success. Now take your fast food application and get out of my office." The absolute dismissal in my voice pushed Paige entirely over the edge. Her mind snapped. She let out a primal blood-curdling scream of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged across my desk. She bypassed the paperwork and grabbed a heavy, solid titanium data server prototype sitting near my computer monitor. It was an incredibly expensive piece of technology, weighing almost 10 pounds. Paige raised the heavy metal block high above her head, intending to smash it directly down onto my laptop to destroy my work. She did not even get the chance to swing. Damon, my head of security, moved with the terrifying speed of a trained operative. He stepped forward, grabbed Paige by the wrist, and twisted her arms smoothly behind her back. The heavy titanium prototype clattered harmlessly onto the carpet. Damon swept Paige's legs out from under her, taking her down to the floor in one fluid, flawless motion. He pinned her chest against the ground, effortlessly pressing a knee between her shoulder blades to neutralize the threat. Paige thrashed and shrieked against the carpet, spitting out a string of vicious profanities as she struggled against his iron grip. William shouted, stepping forward to help his daughter, but a second security guard instantly blocked his path, placing a firm hand on his chest. Damon looked up at me from the floor, keeping Paige securely pinned. "Orders, boss," he asked calmly over the sound of my sister's screaming. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the building's main security desk. "Keep her pinned." "Damon," I instructed, casually adjusting my collar. "We are calling the police. I am pressing formal charges for trespassing and attempted destruction of corporate property. Let us see how the Golden Child handles a county holding cell." It has been exactly 1 month since my security team pinned my screaming sister to the carpet of my penthouse office. 30 days since I handed my parents a fast food job application and watched them walk out of my corporate fortress with absolutely nothing. I genuinely thought I was completely finished with them. I assumed that losing their luxury home and their social standing would finally force them into quiet obscurity. I was wrong. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of audacity. A week ago, a process server walked up to the gates of my estate and handed my security personnel a thick stack of legal documents. My parents, William and Catherine, were actually attempting to sue me in civil court. I read through the summons while drinking my morning coffee, and I actually laughed out loud. The charges they filed were entirely absurd. They were suing me for severe emotional distress and elder abandonment. They claimed that I had maliciously orchestrated their financial ruin and that my vast wealth obligated me to provide them with a permanent standard of living. They had clearly scoured the city to find a desperate strip mall attorney who was willing to take their ridiculous case on contingency. This bottom-tier lawyer obviously thought he had struck gold. He assumed that a billionaire chief executive officer like me would immediately write a massive settlement check just to keep a family lawsuit out of the media. He severely underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. I did not write a settlement check. Instead, I instructed my corporate legal department to agree to a formal mediation session. I did not agree to mediation because I wanted to negotiate. I agreed because I wanted to look my parents dead in the eye one final time while my lawyers dismantled their last pathetic shred of hope. We met on a rainy Tuesday morning in a sterile, windowless conference room at my legal team's downtown headquarters. My lead counsel, Bennett, was a ruthless corporate shark who billed more in a single hour than my parents' former house was actually worth. Bennett sat beside me looking perfectly relaxed in his custom-tailored suit. Sitting directly across the polished glass table, William and Catherine looked absolutely terrible. The brutal stress of moving out of their suburban mansion and into a cramped, cheap apartment had aged them rapidly. My mother had clearly attempted to maintain her country club aesthetic, but her roots were showing, and her designer jacket was noticeably wrinkled. My father looked exhausted with deep dark circles under his eyes and a nervous twitch in his jaw. Their chief attorney, a sweaty man wearing an ill-fitting gray suit, looked completely out of his depth. He glanced around my legal team's fortress, like a terrified mouse that had just wandered into a den of hungry predators. The cheap lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his crooked tie. He opened a flimsy folder and began reading a dramatically prepared statement. He talked about how I owed my parents a fundamental duty of care. He cited my enormous net worth and claimed I had intentionally inflicted severe psychological trauma on a vulnerable elderly couple who had sacrificed everything to raise me. He demanded a settlement of $5 million and a permanent monthly stipend to drop the lawsuit. Bennett let the sweaty little man finish his entire speech without interrupting him a single time. When the room finally fell silent, Bennett calmly reached into his leather briefcase. He slid a single piece of crisp white paper across the polished glass table. It was not a settlement offer. It was a formal motion to countersue for frivolous litigation, accompanied by a demand that my parents pay my entire legal team's exorbitant hourly fees for wasting our time. Bennett folded his hands on the table and began to speak. His voice was soft, but it carried lethal precision. He systematically shredded every single one of their pathetic arguments. He pointed out that there is absolutely no legal requirement in the United States for a financially independent adult to support the parents who formally evicted them at 19 years old. He presented the signed ledger check I had given them, proving we were legally and financially severed. Your clients have absolutely no legal standing, Bennett told the sweating attorney. My client does not owe them a single dime. If you proceed with this baseless lawsuit, we will not only bankrupt you with legal fees, but we will file a formal grievance with the State Bar Association regarding your professional conduct. The cheap attorney swallowed hard, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked at William and Catherine, clearly realizing he had made a colossal mistake taking this case. William slammed his fist down onto the glass table, his face turning bright red. "This is an outrage," William shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You owe us, Blair. We gave you everything. We sacrificed our own financial future to raise you and your sister. You cannot just abandon us like this." I kept my posture perfectly relaxed. I looked at my angry father, feeling absolutely nothing but cold indifference. "You never sacrificed anything for me, William," I said, my voice dead flat. "You spent every available dollar treating Paige like a princess while making me beg for basic necessities." Catherine leaned forward, her eyes blazing with defensive anger. "That is a lie," Catherine snapped. "We provided equally for both of you. We set up funds for your education. You are the one who threw it all away when you dropped out to play with computers." I glanced at Bennett and gave him a very subtle nod. It was time to end this charade permanently. Bennett opened his briefcase one more time. He pulled out a thick manila folder secured with a string tie. He opened the folder and extracted a stack of very old, heavily faded banking documents. He slid the stack directly across the glass table, coming to rest right in front of my mother. Catherine looked down at the top document. The color instantly vanished from her face. She let out a sharp, strangled gasp and covered her mouth with her hands. William looked at the paper and his jaw dropped open in pure, unadulterated terror. "That is a complete record of a defunct college trust fund," Bennett explained, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "It is a trust fund that was established by your late grandmother specifically for Blair's higher education." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table and staring directly into my mother's horrified eyes. "My security operatives are very thorough," I said softly. "When you tried to sue me, I had them run a deep forensic audit on your entire financial history. They found the trust fund that grandmother left for me, the one you told me never existed." The chief attorney looked at the documents, his eyes widening in shock. "The forensic audit proves exactly where that money went." I continued, refusing to let my parents look away. "You did not use it for my education. You illegally drained my entire trust fund when I was a minor. You stole my college money to pay for Paige's multiple cosmetic surgeries and her luxury car when she was in high school. You forged my signature and committed felony embezzlement against your own daughter." The silence in the conference room was absolute and suffocating. My mother, Catherine, stared down at the faded banking documents as if they were covered in poison. Her manicured hands trembled so violently that the heavy paper rattled against the glass table. Beside her, my father William had completely lost the ability to speak. His jaw hung open, his eyes wide with a level of terror I had never seen before. The cheap strip mall attorney leaned over my mother's shoulder to read the documents. I watched the remaining color drain entirely from his sweaty face. He was an amateur, but even he knew what a federal crime looked like when it was printed in black and white. "You forged my signature, William," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "You created a fake custodial account when I was 17 years old. You transferred every single penny my grandmother left for my education into a private fund controlled exclusively by you and Catherine." "That is a complete fabrication," William croaked, his voice cracking. He looked frantically at his lawyer. "Do not listen to her. These documents are fake." Bennett, my lead corporate counsel, did not even blink. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a certified bank ledger from 19 years ago, dropping it onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "These documents were subpoenaed directly from the Federal Banking Archive," Bennett stated coldly. "We have the original deposit slips. We have the fraudulent transfer authorizations. We even have the cleared checks bearing your forged signatures. Do not attempt to perjure yourself in this room, William. We have the entire paper trail." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the cool glass. I locked my eyes onto Catherine, who was actively hyperventilating. "You did not just steal my future," I told her. "You stole it to fund your own ridiculous vanity." The forensic audit showed exactly where my college money went. 2 weeks after you drained my trust fund, you wrote a check for $25,000 to a premier plastic surgeon in Beverly Hills. You bought Paige her first nose job using my tuition money. Catherine let out a sharp, whimpering sound, shaking her head in frantic denial, but she could not form a single word of defense. "A month after that," I continued, my voice rising with steady, calculated authority, "you bought Paige a brand new convertible sports car for her high school graduation. You paid in cash. My cash. You bought your golden child a luxury vehicle while I was working double shifts at a diner just to afford community college application fees. You funded her entire fake high society lifestyle by committing a felony against your own flesh and blood." The chief attorney abruptly stood up from his chair. He frantically shoved his flimsy files into his briefcase, snapping it shut with a loud click. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel," the attorney blurted out, looking at my parents with absolute disgust. "I was hired to represent an elder abandonment civil suit. I was not informed that my clients had committed felony embezzlement and wire fraud. I will not be a party to this." He did not wait for them to respond. He turned and practically sprinted out of the conference room, abandoning them entirely. William and Catherine were now completely alone. They had no legal representation, no money, no house, and no leverage. They were completely at my mercy. Bennett folded his hands on the table and looked at them with the detached efficiency of a corporate executioner. "The statute of limitations for financial fraud against a minor extends significantly when the victim is kept unaware of the trust fund's existence," Bennett explained. "Because you actively concealed this inheritance, my client is well within her rights to press federal charges today." I sat back in my chair, watching the reality of their situation crush the last remaining shreds of their arrogance. "Here is your choice," I said, dictating the final terms of their surrender. "You have exactly 2 minutes to drop your ridiculous civil lawsuit against me. You will sign a legally binding non-disclosure agreement and a permanent order of protection stating that you will never approach me, my home, or my company ever again." "And if we refuse," William whispered, his voice barely audible. "If you refuse, or if you hesitate for even a second, I will have Bennett call the district attorney immediately," I promised. "We will hand over this entire folder of evidence. Embezzling a minor's trust fund carries a mandatory federal prison sentence. You will lose your freedom. You will be assigned to a federal penitentiary, and you can spend the next decade sitting in a cell block right next to your precious son-in-law, Kendrick." The threat of actual prison time broke them completely. The facade of their perfect suburban marriage instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in, and they immediately turned on each other like cornered animals. "This was your fault," Catherine screamed, turning her furious, tear-streaked face toward my father. "You were the one who authorized the bank transfers. You told me the money was unrestricted. You said your business was struggling, and we needed the cash to maintain our social standing. Do not you dare put this entirely on me," William roared back, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at his wife. "You are the one who demanded we pay for Paige's cosmetic surgeries. You said we had to invest in her appearance so she could marry a wealthy man. You spent my entire paycheck on country club fees and designer clothes. I only took that trust fund because you would not stop spending money we did not have. You were the man of the house, Catherine shrieked, hitting his arm. You were supposed to provide for us. Instead, you were a weak, pathetic failure who had to steal from a teenager to buy your favorite daughter a car. I sat in silence, watching the two people who had made my childhood a living nightmare completely destroy each other. They were shouting vicious, cruel insults, exposing decades of hidden resentments and toxic hatred. Their marriage had always been a performance, an empty shell, built on fake wealth and public validation. Now, with the money gone and the threat of prison hanging over their heads, the performance was over. Bennett slid a pen and the withdrawal documents across the glass table. Sign the papers, I commanded, cutting through their screaming match. Sign them right now and get out of my sight. William and Catherine stopped shouting. Breathing heavily and glaring at each other with pure venom, they both reached for the pen. They scribbled their signatures onto the legal documents, abandoning their lawsuit and relinquishing any future right to contact me. They threw the pen down on the table and stood up. They did not look at me. They did not apologize. They simply turned and walked out of the conference room, walking as far apart from each other as physically possible. As the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung shut behind them, leaving Bennett and me alone in the quiet space, I let out a long, slow breath. For 14 years, I had carried the heavy burden of their rejection. I had spent countless nights wondering why I was never good enough for their love. I had exhausted myself trying to understand how a mother and a father could look at their own child and feel nothing but disdain. Now I finally had the entire truth. It was never about my lack of worth. It was never about my decision to study coding. It was always about their own consuming greed. They had turned me into the family villain because it was the only way they could justify stealing my future. They had to make me the bad guy so they could sleep at night after robbing me blind to fund their superficial lives. Bennett gathered the signed documents, placing them neatly into his leather briefcase. He looked across the table, his sharp, professional demeanor softening just a fraction. "It is done," Blair Bennett said quietly. "They are legally barred from your life. The court will process these injunctions by the end of the day. You never have to deal with them again." I stood up from the table, walking over to the large floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the bustling city streets below. The rain had stopped, and the gray clouds were finally beginning to break apart, letting sharp beams of sunlight pierce through the gloom. I watched the tiny figures of people hurrying along the sidewalks, going about their daily lives, completely unaware of the massive empire I had built far above them. "Thank you, Bennett," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on the horizon. "Send the rest of the documentation to the archival vault. I do not want to look at those bank statements ever again." I watched two figures emerge from the lobby doors far below. Even from this height, I recognized my parents. They were standing on the wet pavement, but they were not speaking to each other. William hailed a cheap yellow cab, getting into the back seat and slamming the door without waiting for Catherine. The cab drove away, leaving my mother standing alone on the sidewalk, clutching her wrinkled designer jacket against the cold wind. She had no money, no home, no golden child to protect her, and now she did not even have her husband. I turned away from the window, feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my entire 33 years of existence. The past was officially dead and buried. My future belonged entirely to me. 3 weeks had passed since I watched my parents walk out of my corporate boardroom with absolutely nothing. My legal and financial severances from the people who had made my childhood a nightmare were fully complete. The injunctions were filed, and the strict no-contact orders were firmly in place. But there was still one loose end remaining from that disastrous wedding night. One final piece of the puzzle that required my personal attention before I could truly close this ugly chapter of my life forever. I sat in the back of my armored Maybach as my driver navigated the bleak industrial roads leading to the federal holding facility. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over the towering concrete walls and thick rolls of razor wire surrounding the compound. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the crystal chandeliers and imported white orchids of the luxury hotel where this entire nightmare began. I was escorted through 3 separate security checkpoints by heavily armed federal guards. Even inside a high-security prison, my status as the chief executive officer of a top-tier security and private asset protection firm granted me a certain level of undeniable deference. The warden had personally authorized a private visitation room for my arrival. It was a small windowless space painted a sickening shade of institutional beige. There was a single thick metal table bolted directly to the linoleum floor and two rigid steel chairs. I sat down in the cold room and waited. 5 minutes later, the heavy steel door clicked open. Two guards escorted Kendrick inside. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering. The arrogant, swaggering groom who had threatened to have me thrown out into the freezing street was completely gone. He had been stripped of his custom-tailored tuxedo, his expensive silk tie, and his imported Italian leather shoes. He was now wearing a baggy, faded orange jumpsuit issued by the federal government. His posture was slumped, his shoulders hunched forward, as if the sheer weight of his spectacular downfall was physically crushing him. The arrogant fire in his dark eyes had been completely extinguished, leaving him looking hollow, desperate, and pathetic. The guards removed his metal handcuffs and stepped outside, closing the heavy door behind them with a loud echoing thud. We were completely alone. Kendrick sank heavily into the steel chair across from me. He looked at my pristine tailored business suit and then looked down at his own bright orange uniform. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "Why are you here, Blair?" Kendrick asked, his voice raspy and incredibly weak. "Did you come to gloat? Have you not done enough to me already? My father publicly disowned me. I am facing 7 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. You won." I kept my hands folded neatly on the metal table. "I did not win, Kendrick," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I simply survived. You are the one who destroyed your own life the second you decided to steal from your own family to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle." Kendrick leaned forward, pressing his hands against his face. "You do not understand the incredible pressure I was under," he whispered, attempting to generate a pathetic shred of sympathy. "My father expected absolute perfection. He expected me to be a ruthless titan of industry just like him. But I was not him. I could not make the massive real estate deals happen. When I met your sister, she looked at me like I was a king. Paige made me feel powerful and respected. I just wanted to give her the world. I truly loved her, Blair. Everything I did, the embezzlement, the lies, the stolen funds, I did it because I loved her and wanted to give her the high society dynasty she deserved." I stared at him, feeling absolutely zero pity for his ridiculous manufactured excuses. He was actually sitting in a federal prison trying to play the romantic victim. "Do not insult my intelligence, Kendrick," I replied, my tone dropping to a cold, hard edge. "You did not steal $12 million for love. You stole it for your own fragile ego. You needed the expensive sports cars, the private jet leases, and the VIP club access to mask your own severe incompetence. But that is not why I took time out of my busy corporate schedule to visit you today." Kendrick looked up, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of genuine confusion. "Then why are you here?" I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper. I slid it slowly across the cold metal table, stopping it right in front of his hands. "When my cybersecurity team at Aegis Vanguard locked down your father's real estate servers, we did a full forensic trace on the $12 million you embezzled," I explained, watching the dread slowly creep back onto his face. "You were very sloppy, Kendrick. You funneled the stolen corporate capital through a complex web of 3 different shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. You used fake vendor invoices and phantom consulting fees to move the cash. You honestly thought that money was safely hidden away beyond the reach of the United States federal government. You thought that even if you went to prison, you would have a massive offshore nest egg waiting for you when you got out." Kendrick stared at the piece of paper. His chest began to heave with sudden panicked breaths. His eyes darted across the printed financial routing numbers. "I bought the debt of those shell companies, Kendrick," I continued, delivering the final crushing blow. "I used my corporate acquisitions team to purchase the controlling interest in the very holding firms you used to hide your stolen cash. As the new legal owner of those entities, I authorized a full liquidation of assets to pay off the outstanding debts you owed to my company." Kendrick let out a ragged, gasping sound. "What are you saying?" he choked out, grabbing the edge of the table. I am saying the offshore accounts are entirely empty, I stated with absolute finality. I seized every single penny you tried to hide. You have absolutely nothing left. You do not have a secret stash. You do not have a financial safety net. When you eventually get out of this prison, you will be walking out with exactly $0 to your name. Kendrick buried his face in his hands, letting out a muffled, devastating sob. He had lost his freedom, his powerful family, his reputation, and now his hidden fortune. He was completely and utterly ruined. Please, he wept, his voice muffled by his shaking hands. Just tell Paige I am sorry. Tell her I tried my best. Tell her I still love her and I hope she waits for me. I stood up from the steel chair, smoothing out my jacket. I looked down at the broken man sitting across from me, recognizing that he and my sister were two sides of the exact same toxic coin. They had built an entire relationship on superficial greed and mutual deception. I didn't come here to gloat, Kendrick. I came to tell you that Paige has already filed for an annulment and is blaming you for everything. You two truly deserved each other. The morning air was crisp and biting as I stood on the pristine sidewalk of my childhood neighborhood. This was an exclusive gated community defined by perfectly manicured lawns, towering oak trees, and an unspoken strict code of high society conduct. For 19 years, I had walked these very sidewalks feeling like an unwanted ghost. I was the dark stain on William and Catherine's flawless suburban tapestry. Today I returned not as a ghost, but as the absolute architect of their destruction. I leaned against the polished hood of my armored Maybach, crossing my arms over my dark wool coat. Damon, my head of security, stood a few feet away, maintaining a silent, vigilant watch. Directly in front of us, sitting on the expensive cobblestone driveway of my parents' former luxury estate, was a fleet of heavy yellow demolition machinery. The massive hydraulic excavators idled loudly, their diesel engines roaring and sending thick plumes of exhaust into the clear blue sky. The site foreman, wearing a bright neon vest and a hard hat, walked over to me holding a digital tablet. "We are ready to proceed on your command, boss," the foreman said, raising his radio. "The utilities have been completely severed, and the structural permits are fully cleared." I looked at the towering brick facade of the house. I stared at the heavy mahogany front door. It was the exact same door my parents had locked behind me when they threw me out into the freezing rain all those years ago. I looked up at the large bay window on the second floor, which used to belong to Paige. That was the room where my stolen college trust fund had been transformed into designer handbags and cosmetic surgeries. "Tear it down," I commanded, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "Tear it all down to the dirt." The foreman spoke into his radio. The massive metal claw of the primary excavator raised high into the air. With a deafening mechanical screech, the machine lurched forward and swung its heavy steel arm directly into the grand entryway of the mansion. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood echoed like a bomb blast through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. The expensive custom brickwork crumpled instantly under the sheer force of the hydraulic claw. I watched with profound, absolute tranquility as the roof of the grand foyer caved in, sending a massive billowing cloud of gray dust into the air. The excavator ripped through the walls, tearing open the living room, where I had been endlessly mocked and belittled. It smashed through the expensive gourmet kitchen, where I was told I was a burden who ate too much of their food. Every swing of the heavy machinery pulverized another toxic memory, turning the physical monument of my childhood abuse into a pile of worthless, splintered garbage. The deafening noise of the destruction inevitably drew an audience. One by one, the wealthy neighbors began stepping out onto their pristine front lawns. These were the country club socialites, the local gossip columnists, and the judgmental elites who had spent decades looking down on me. For years, Catherine had fed these neighbors a steady diet of malicious lies. She had told them I was a dropout, a failure, a lazy delinquent who refused to work. They had nodded sympathetically, drinking their mimosas and pitying the poor parents who had to deal with such a defective child. But today, the neighborhood dynamic was entirely different. The truth had finally come out. The news of Kendrick's spectacular arrest for federal wire fraud had dominated the local and national financial headlines for the past week. The dramatic collapse of the fake billionaire wedding was the biggest scandal this community had ever seen. Furthermore, the details of my parents' utter financial ruin had leaked through the country club grapevine. Everyone now knew that William and Catherine had been evicted completely bankrupt and had actively embezzled their own daughter's trust fund. More importantly, the neighbors now knew exactly who I was. They knew that the supposed failure they had judged for 14 years was actually the billionaire chief executive officer of Aegis Vanguard. They knew I was the apex predator who had bought the neighborhood's crown jewel in cash solely for the pleasure of crushing it into dust. I turned my head and locked eyes with a group of wealthy women standing in the driveway next door. They physically flinched when my gaze met theirs. They huddled together, whispering furiously, their eyes wide with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. They did not dare approach me. They realized that the power dynamic had completely shifted. I was no longer the neighborhood outcast. I was a force of nature that could buy and destroy their entire lives without breaking a sweat. I offered them a cold, sharp smile, and they immediately looked down at the pavement, too intimidated to hold eye contact. I turned my attention back to the demolition. The entire second floor of the mansion collapsed inward, sending another massive shockwave of dust rolling across the street. As the dust cloud slowly began to settle, my eyes caught a flash of bright neon color moving erratically in the distance. I looked past the debris across the wide four-lane commercial boulevard that bordered the edge of the gated residential neighborhood. Sitting on the corner of the busy intersection was a cheap discount mattress store. Standing on the dirty public sidewalk directly in front of the store was a person wearing an oversized bright yellow promotional t-shirt. They were holding a massive cardboard advertisement sign shaped like a mattress, aggressively spinning it around to attract the attention of passing cars. I squinted through the settling dust, watching the sign spinner struggle with the heavy cardboard. The person tried to execute a complicated spin, but they tripped over their own feet. The heavy sign hit the concrete, and the person stumbled backward. The cheap corporate visor they were wearing was knocked loose and fell onto the dirty pavement. A head of tangled, unkempt blonde hair fell forward. The person scrambled to pick up the visor, looking up in a sheer panic. It was Paige, the former golden child. The woman who had demanded penthouses and private jets was now standing on a busy street corner, spinning a cardboard sign for minimum wage. Paige froze. She was looking directly across the boulevard. She was looking past the construction equipment right at the spot where her luxurious childhood castle was being brutally torn to the ground. Then her eyes shifted slightly and locked directly onto me. She saw me standing next to my armored Maybach, watching her. The utter total humiliation crashed over her like a tidal wave. The realization that I was watching her flip cheap advertisement signs while I casually demolished her entire legacy completely broke her spirit. Paige let out a visible gasp, dropping the cardboard sign entirely. She threw her hands over her face, turning her back to the street, and sprinting toward the alleyway behind the mattress store, desperate to hide her profound shame. I did not laugh. I did not smile. I simply turned back to watch the final structural support of the mansion snap, in half, sending the rest of the toxic house crashing down into the dirt. The physical erasure was finally complete. The frantic chaos of the past month slowly faded, giving way to a profound sense of clarity. The dust had literally and figuratively settled over my childhood neighborhood. I stood on a raised wooden platform, looking out over the massive, perfectly leveled plot of dirt where William and Catherine's suburban mansion had once stood. The physical erasure was complete, and now the rebirth could finally begin. Today was the official groundbreaking ceremony for the Aegis Youth Tech Center. I had fully funded the $50 million project with my own capital. This was not going to be a simple community center with a few basketball hoops and a broken ping-pong table. I had designed a state-of-the-art technology campus. It would feature reinforced glass classrooms, advanced server farms, and residential wings, providing secure housing for marginalized teenagers. I was building a sanctuary for brilliant kids who had been thrown out onto the street by toxic, abusive parents. I was giving them the exact safety net I had been denied 14 years ago. The event had drawn a massive crowd. City council members, tech industry leaders, and local business owners mingled around the catered breakfast tables. Dozens of news vans lined the street with cameras pointed directly at the stage. The media was obsessed with the narrative of a self-made billionaire tearing down her childhood home to build a charity fortress. As I reviewed my notes for the opening speech, the crowd near the entrance parted respectfully. Winston stepped onto the property. The 60-year-old real estate mogul looked entirely different than he had on the night of the ruined wedding. The frantic, sweating man who had bowed to me in a ballroom was gone. He had regained his sharp, imposing aura. He wore a pristine charcoal suit, walking with the heavy dignity of a survivor. He walked straight up to the platform and extended his hand. We had spent the last month in ruthless corporate negotiations, dismantling his fraudulent son's mess and restructuring his massive commercial real estate portfolio under the absolute control of Aegis Vanguard. During those grueling boardroom battles, Winston and I had developed a profound mutual respect. We were both self-made predators who understood the cold mathematics of survival. "It is a good day for building, Miss Blair Winston," said his deep voice, carrying a tone of genuine admiration. I reviewed the architectural blueprints for the center. It is an incredible facility. I brought the finalized paperwork from my board of directors. My firm will be providing guaranteed paid internships in our commercial development sector for every single student who graduates from your cybersecurity boot camp. I accepted his firm handshake. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment the two most powerful titans in the city solidified a massive, legitimate corporate partnership. "I appreciate the commitment, Winston," I replied. "You are proving that a legacy is not about bloodlines. It is about the structure you leave behind for the next generation." "You destroyed my son," Winston noted, keeping his voice low so the reporters could not hear. "But you saved my life's work. Kendrick is sitting in a federal cell facing 7 years, and my company is stronger than it has ever been. It is a strange, harsh reality, but I am a pragmatic man. You have my loyalty." "Your son destroyed himself, Winston," I corrected him smoothly. I simply handed him the bill. "Welcome to the new era." Winston nodded, taking his place among the VIP guests. The ceremony began. The morning sun warmed the cool air as the mayor gave a brief introduction, praising my investment in the city. Then it was my turn. A young, ambitious reporter from a major national news network pushed her way to the front of the press line. She held a microphone up toward the stage, her eyes bright with the prospect of a viral soundbite. "Miss Blair," the reporter called out, her voice cutting through the ambient chatter of the crowd. "This is an incredibly emotional day. You are breaking ground on a $50 million charity center right on top of the exact plot of land where you grew up. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. Are your parents, William and Catherine, here in the crowd today? Is your family proud of the incredible work you are doing for this community?" The entire crowd went completely silent. The local politicians and tech executives held their breath. Everyone in that neighborhood knew the vicious rumors Catherine had spread about me for 14 years, and they all knew about the spectacular public downfall of my family just a month ago. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I stepped right up to the edge of the platform and looked directly into the lens of the primary news camera. "My biological parents are not here today," I said, my voice ringing with absolute crystal-clear authority over the silent crowd. "They are not here because they do not have the clearance to step foot on my property. For my entire life, they told everyone who would listen that I was a failure. They threw me out into the freezing rain because I chose to write code instead of following their superficial script. They committed felony embezzlement against me to fund a fake high-society lifestyle for my sister." The reporters eagerly absorbed every single word. The camera operators zoomed in tightly on my face, capturing the unwavering conviction in my eyes. "People talk a lot about the sanctity of family," I continued, projecting my voice effortlessly. "They tell you that blood is thicker than water and that you owe your parents blind loyalty simply because they gave you basic shelter. That is a toxic, dangerous lie. Biology is just an accident of birth. True family is built on respect, integrity, and mutual protection. If the people who share your DNA treat you like garbage, you have zero obligation to keep them in your life." I gripped the edges of the wooden podium, letting my words sink into the minds of everyone watching. "You asked if my family is proud of me," I said, staring right through the camera lens. "I do not care if they are proud. I bought the dirt they stood on. I demolished the monument to their greed. and today I am planting a much better future directly over the rubble of their failures. This youth center is for every kid who was ever told they were not good enough by the people who were supposed to love them the most. We are going to teach them how to build their own empires, so they never have to beg for a seat at a table where they are not respected. I stepped back from the microphone. The crowd erupted into deafening applause. Winston nodded in deep approval, an uncharacteristic smile crossing his face. By the time I picked up the golden shovel to break the first layer of dirt, the video clip of my speech was already circulating online. Within 3 hours, it would be the #1 trending video nationwide, completely cementing my legacy and permanently sealing the absolute ruin of the people who had tried to break me. 6 months after the demolition of my childhood home, the holiday season arrived, bringing with it a profound sense of absolute victory. It was Thanksgiving evening, and the sprawling formal dining room of my Beverly Hills estate was filled with the kind of genuine warmth I had never experienced growing up. A massive custom-built mahogany table stretched across the room, illuminated by brilliant crystal chandeliers. The table was laden with an extravagant feast prepared by my private culinary team, featuring roasted duck truffles and vintage wines. But the real wealth in the room was the company. The table was surrounded by 30 of my most trusted employees, my elite security operatives, and the brilliant corporate executives who had helped me build Aegis Vanguard into a global superpower. My head of security, Damon, was sitting at the far end of the table, laughing genuinely at a story being told by my lead corporate counsel, Bennett. Even Winston, the powerful real estate mogul, had accepted an exclusive invitation to join us. Winston sat near the head of the table holding a glass of aged bourbon, looking completely at ease among my inner circle. This was my chosen family. There was no toxic competition, no bitter judgment, and no fake high society posturing. We were a fortress of loyalty and mutual respect. Outside my reinforced impact-resistant windows, a sudden, aggressive winter storm had rolled into the California hills. Torrential freezing rain battered the glass, and heavy winds howled through the canyon. But inside my home, the massive stone fireplace kept everything perfectly warm and entirely secure. Just as the private chefs began bringing out the decadent dessert courses, Damon felt a sharp vibration from his tactical smartwatch. He glanced down at the screen, and his relaxed smile instantly vanished, replaced by total professional focus. He stood up smoothly, excusing himself from the table, and walked purposefully over to where I was sitting. He leaned down and placed his encrypted digital tablet right next to my wineglass. "Boss, we have an unauthorized perimeter breach attempt at the main security gate," Damon whispered, keeping his voice low so the other guests would not have their evening disturbed. "2 individuals are aggressively requesting access to the property. They are claiming to be your parents." I set down my silver fork and looked at the high-definition night vision feed displaying on the tablet screen. The advanced cameras at the front edge of my $50 million estate captured everything in flawless, crystal-clear detail. Standing out in the freezing torrential rain, completely unprotected from the harsh elements, were William and Catherine. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. The arrogant country club elites, who had spent their entire lives obsessing over designer brands and maintaining a pristine social status, had been reduced to literal beggars at my gate. William was wearing a cheap, thin windbreaker that was soaked completely through, clinging tightly to his hunched, shivering frame. Catherine stood next to him, looking completely ragged and totally exhausted. Her hair was plastered flat against her face by the heavy rain, and her expensive cosmetic enhancements only made her look more desperate under the harsh security lights. She was frantically clutching a flimsy plastic container holding a cheap store-bought pumpkin pie. They had lost their suburban mansion. They had lost their entire retirement fund to Kendrick's massive fraud. They had lost the fraudulent civil lawsuit they tried to file against me. And now, on a major family holiday, they were standing in the biting cold, staring up at the massive steel security gates of the daughter they had violently thrown away. Catherine pressed the intercom button again, her hands shaking violently from the freezing wind. "Blair," she called out, her voice distorted and desperate through the live audio feed. "Blair, please answer the gate. We know you are in there. It is Thanksgiving. We brought pie for dessert. We just want to see you. We want to apologize and be a family again. We have nowhere else to go." Damon looked down at me, waiting for my explicit command. Do you want me to send a patrol vehicle down the driveway to physically remove them from the perimeter? He asked, his tone indicating he was fully prepared to drag them away by force. I stared at the glowing screen, watching them shiver in the freezing downpour. I thought about the night I was 19 years old, standing in the exact same kind of freezing rain, begging them to let me sleep on their couch. I remembered the heavy metallic sound of their deadbolt locking, leaving me out in the dark cold with nothing but 3 garbage bags full of my belongings. "No, Damon," I said calmly, pushing my heavy oak chair back from the dining table. "Do not send the patrol. I will handle this myself." I stood up and walked over to the primary security console mounted on the wall near the grand entryway. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the 2 shivering figures on the screen. I did not feel a shred of guilt or lingering familial obligation. I only felt the absolute unyielding closure of a circle finally completing itself. I pressed the silver intercom button, opening a direct 2-way audio channel to the heavy steel gates at the very bottom of the hill. William and Catherine flinched as the intercom speaker crackled to life, projecting my voice clearly and loudly through the heavy rain. "Blair!" Catherine cried out, leaning dangerously close to the speaker box and holding up the cheap plastic pie container like a pathetic offering. "Sweetheart, please just let us in. We have absolutely nothing left. We are living in a horrible, cramped apartment. We are so incredibly cold, and we just want to sit at the table with our daughter. We can fix this. We can start over." I looked at the live feed, watching the total desperation twist their faces into masks of pure panic. 14 years ago, I stood on your wet driveway and begged for a safe place to sleep, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, commanding tone that echoed sharply out of the gate speakers, cutting right through the storm. You looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a failure. You told me I was an embarrassment to your perfect country club image, and you told me that I was not fit to sit at your family table. William stepped closer to the speaker, freezing water dripping heavily from his nose and chin. We were wrong, Blair. He pleaded, his voice cracking with miserable regret. We made a terrible mistake. Please just open the gate. Have some mercy. I kept my finger firmly pressed on the button. You were not wrong, William, I replied smoothly, remaining perfectly detached from their immense suffering. You were absolutely right. I am not fit to sit at your table because your table was built on fake wealth, toxic manipulation, and extreme greed. My table is for people with actual loyalty and undeniable honor. You do not qualify for a seat. Go home. Before either of them could utter another pathetic, weeping word, I released the intercom button. I reached up and flipped the master override switch, permanently cutting the audio and visual feed to the front gates. The screen went entirely black, shutting them out of my world forever. Exactly 1 year has passed since I turned off the security monitor and left my parents standing in the freezing rain. 365 days since I permanently severed the final rotting thread that connected me to the people who had made my childhood a living nightmare. The passage of time is a brilliant, ruthless filter. It clears away the chaotic noise and leaves behind only the absolute, undeniable truth. And the truth of my life today is nothing short of a masterpiece. Let us look at where the ashes of their fake dynasty finally settled. Kendrick is currently serving a 7-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The arrogant groom who once threatened to throw me out of my own hotel is now scrubbing cafeteria trays and mopping concrete hallways for pennies an hour. He wears a faded orange jumpsuit that hangs loosely on his thinning, defeated frame. His African-American real estate mogul father, Winston, kept his absolute promise. Winston completely froze Kendrick out of the family trust and formally legally disowned him. Kendrick receives 0 commissary money and 0 visitors. He sits in his tiny concrete cell every single night, fully realizing that his desperate greed and fragile ego cost him an empire he was meant to inherit. My parents, William and Catherine, are living a bleak reality they used to openly mock. They reside in a cramped, moldy 1-bedroom apartment directly next to a roaring, elevated train track. The deafening noise of the passing trains shakes their cheap, thin windows every 15 minutes, vibrating the very floorboards. Catherine, who spent her entire adult life obsessing over country club gossip and designer handbags, now spends her afternoons aggressively clipping grocery coupons just to afford basic meals. She wears faded, out-of-style clothes, and her expensive cosmetic enhancements are rapidly deteriorating without the exorbitant funds required to maintain them. William spends his days sitting in a broken recliner, staring blankly at a small television. They absolutely despise each other. They spend their evenings screaming bitterly, blaming one another for handing their entire life savings to a fraudster. Their marriage is a toxic, hollow prison of their own making. They have no money, no status, and no one left to manipulate. But the most spectacular downfall belongs to Paige. The golden child who spent 29 years treating me like a peasant is now working 2 grueling minimum wage jobs just to afford a rented room in a terrible part of the city. During the day, she works the drive-through window at a local fast food chain. She rides the public bus home every afternoon smelling strongly of old frying grease and industrial bleach. At night, she works as a low-tier retail associate, folding clothes for customers who do not even look at her. The heavy, crushing stress of actual manual labor has completely erased her vanity. Her hands are burned from hot oil and heavily calloused. Her perfect posture is gone, replaced by the permanent slump of exhaustion. Every single time she wipes down a sticky counter, she is forced to remember that she orchestrated her own ruin. She wanted to be the only success in the family, and now she is the ultimate definition of a failure. While they drown in the miserable consequences of their own actions, I am breathing the rarest air at the absolute summit of the corporate world. This morning I stood in a sleek photography studio in downtown Los Angeles. A team of professional lighting directors and photographers adjusted their equipment around me. I wore a custom-tailored midnight black power suit. I looked directly into the camera lens with unwavering, absolute confidence. Tomorrow, my face will be on the front cover of Forbes magazine. The bold headline printed across the glossy cover reads, "The Unbreakable Empire: How the Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Vanguard Rewrote the Rules of Global Security." I am officially listed as one of the most influential and wealthiest women in the technology sector, but the massive, staggering wealth is only a fraction of my actual victory. My true triumph is the absolute peace I wake up with every single day. I am surrounded by my chosen family. My Chief Operating Officer Bennett and my Head of Security Damon are not just my employees. They are my fiercely loyal inner circle. We recently closed another multi-billion-dollar merger alongside Winston, solidifying a dominant corporate alliance that controls massive sectors of the commercial market. Winston and I operate with a cold, ruthless mutual respect. We do not pretend to be warm and fuzzy. We simply protect our empires and honor our agreements. The Aegis Youth Tech Center opened its doors 3 months ago. Every day I watch brilliant, marginalized teenagers walk into a safe, fully funded sanctuary. Kids who were kicked out by toxic parents are now learning advanced coding and cybersecurity. They are being given the exact safety net I had to build for myself with bare, bleeding hands. Watching them thrive and secure high-paying jobs is the greatest return on investment I could ever possibly ask for. I am standing right now on the private tarmac of an exclusive executive airport. The warm California breeze pulls at the lapels of my jacket. Waiting for me just a few feet away is my custom matte black private jet. The engines are humming quietly, ready to take me to a global summit in Tokyo. Before I walk up those stairs, I want to leave you with one final thought. Society will try to tell you that blood is thicker than water. They will try to convince you that you owe your parents and your siblings blind loyalty, simply because you share the same DNA. They will tell you that family is everything, and that you must forgive toxic, abusive behavior just to keep the peace. That is a dangerous, manipulative lie. Biology is nothing but a random accident of birth. True family is not determined by a birth certificate. True family is determined by consistent loyalty, mutual respect, and absolute protection. If the people who are supposed to love you the most treat you like an acceptable casualty, you have zero obligation to keep them in your life. You do not owe them your sanity. You do not owe them your future. You have the absolute right to lock the door and walk away. People will tell you that the best revenge is forgiveness. They are wrong. The sweetest, most satisfying revenge in the world is not anger, and it is not forgiveness. The best revenge is a spectacular, untouchable success. It is building an empire so massive and so brilliant that your abusers are forced to watch you conquer the world from the filthy gutter where they belong. I am the architect of my own life. I am the apex predator of my industry, and I have never been happier. I turn my back on the setting sun. I walk up the air stairs and step into the luxurious quiet cabin of my jet. The heavy acoustic door seals shut behind me with a firm, definitive click, locking the past out forever. We are cleared for takeoff. The most profound lesson from this journey is that biology does not dictate your destiny or define your true family. For years, I believed I had to tolerate manipulation simply because we shared a bloodline. However, real family is built entirely on mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine protection. When the people meant to cherish you choose to break you instead, walking away is not a failure, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. The sweetest revenge will always be untouchable success and absolute peace. Have you ever walked away from toxic relatives to protect yourself? Share your story and comment below.